Chapter 27:17. Bai Jian's interest was piqued when he heard that. He had been holding back for so long, and the other party finally had the guts to fight them head-on. He thought that those guys would give in one by one until they could no longer avoid it. Now, it seemed like his thoughts were superfluous. As long as the other party dared to fight, the matter would be much easier to handle. Xiaoyang frowned slightly. He looked at the passing scenery below and began to think quickly in his mind. Is there something special about the other party choosing to set up a formation 50 kilometers away? Or are they able to be so fearless because they have the right time, people, and geographical advantage? These are all worth thinking about. Thinking about that, Xiaoyang could only suppress some thoughts for the time being and think about the deeper meaning behind it. Princess Mingzhu also withdrew her divine sense because her limit was 50 kilometers away. If the other party seized the opportunity to target her, she would probably be injured. Since a great battle was about to begin, some unnecessary injuries naturally had to be avoided as much as possible. Otherwise, she would probably be at a disadvantage in the end, and it was not worth it. On the eve of a great battle, it was important to ensure that one's condition was at its peak. Sometimes, even if it was just a little bit of damage, it was very likely that the entire battle would have an earth-shattering change. Between powerhouses, sometimes some inconspicuous details would determine the outcome. Moreover, they had taken a risk to come here this time, so they could not afford to make any mistakes. Once there were too many variables, they would have to pay a heavy price. Princess Mingzhu dared not be careless. After all, if they ended up not being able to return, they would really be harming their own lives. Looking at the mountains below, not a single cultivator made a move, which made Princess Mingzhu smile bitterly. From this point, it was enough to see that the Mo family had probably ordered them not to make a move. To be able to be so orderly, it was clear how terrifying the Mo family's control was. Moreover, there were other sayings as well. Military discipline was strict, and such a team's lethality was quite terrifying and could not be ignored. Soaring Cloud Mountain is 50 kilometers away. Xiaoyang suddenly frowned and said. Bai Jian and Princess Mingzhu looked at Xiaoyang. Their eyes were filled with doubt. Could it be that there was something special about Soaring Cloud Mountain? There is a river behind Soaring Cloud Mountain called the Raging River. On the other side of the furious river is the Mo clan's lair, Xiaoyang said with a hint of fear in his eyes. The distance between these 3 points and one line was only a few dozen miles. Moreover, this line just happened to be on the path of their airship. As a result, they couldn't help but make more guesses. In other words, the other party wants to use these 3 points and one line to deal a fatal blow to us. They're all linked together and don't give us any time to breathe. As Princess Mingzhu spoke, her expression became more serious. They would not question such a possibility. After all, this was indeed the best way to deal with them. Xiaoyang nodded. This made him feel a little strange. These guys really had brains. They knew how to make use of the geographical advantage to counterattack. This could also be said to be a shock. Do we need to change our route and charge into their lair from another direction? Princess Mingzhu asked softly. If they avoided the brunt of the attack, it would save them a lot of trouble. If we face them head-on, if we change our route, I'm afraid the other party will think that we're afraid of them. Since we want to kill them, we'll do it to the end. Moreover, if we change our route, the other party can also change their line of defense, Xiaoyang said softly. Because the other party was too concentrated, it would be very easy for them to change their line of defense. If they did that, they would be at a disadvantage. Therefore, it was better to deal with all changes by remaining unchanged. However, Xiaoyang was not as relaxed as he looked. The In-Flame world's response showed too many problems. If they were not careful, they would be consigned to eternal damnation. Even though he had prepared an escape route for himself, it was still doubtful whether he could use it. That's good, Princess Mingzhu said with a smile. Bai Jian took out many treasured swords and wiped them carefully with a brocade cloth. In the face of the upcoming battle, he naturally needed to use many treasured swords. Naturally, he had to wipe them clean so that they would be of use later. At the same time, Bai Jian began to quickly calculate what kind of method he should use next to minimize the losses. It wasn't easy for them to charge over in one go. The other party's psychological control and some schemes were not bad at all. Although it could not be said that they were evenly matched, they were fighting in the other party's home ground, so they were naturally in a disadvantageous situation. Princess Ming Zhu rubbed the jade pendant in her hand. The speed of the flying ship did not change at all. It was neither fast nor slow. The more it was like this, the more it was necessary to keep one's state of mind in a more peaceful state. Sometimes a little disturbance could affect the performance of their strength. Therefore, it was naturally very clear how to make this choice. These guys, they still want to continue testing us at Soaring Cloud Mountain. Xiaoyang sensed the specific situation, and the smile on his face became a bit more playful. It was not without reason that the Yin Flame realm could resist the tyrannical Myriad Beast realm for thousands of years. They were not weak to begin with, and compared to the Myriad Beast realm, they had an extra brain. Even though the Myriad Beast realm was stronger than the Yin Flame realm, they had only taken down a small part of the south in thousands of years of struggle. The speed of their advancement was extremely slow. In addition, the cultivators produced by the Yin Flame realm on such a battlefield were not weak either. They had all gone through countless battles to reach where they were today. Compared to others, how could they be much weaker? Flowing Cloud Realm. A streak of sword light streaked across the sky and landed in the middle of the mountain. An old man with white hair and beard carried a treasured sword on his back. He looked at the clear sky and smiled. Then a golden light flashed and a middle-aged man in yellow robes landed steadily like a mountain. "Divine Emperor, I didn't expect you to be so fast." The old man cupped his hands and said with a smile. The two of them were the strongest defenders of the Four Realm Alliance, the Divine Emperor and Li Fengmu. Previously, they had each received a message from their juniors. A battle was about to begin, so they had come here to wait for reinforcements. Chapter 27:18. Although their respective juniors did not explicitly ask them to wait here for reinforcements, they still thought that the Yin Flame realm was a tiger's den and a dragon's pool. The first battle that had been delayed for a long time was about to erupt. In order to prevent any accidents, they still came. When the time came, if those three little fellows were really in danger, they only needed to enter the secret realm from the Flowing Cloud realm and rush to the battlefield at the fastest speed possible. I heard from Ming Zhu that the Mo family's forces have always been holed up. Now that they're about to fight, I'm afraid it won't be that simple, said the God Emperor. The God Emperor was a man of great talent and strategy. Before he became the God Emperor, he had already fought in the East and West. Of course, the wars between the God realm and other worlds had always been rare. When he had nothing to do, the God Emperor liked to watch the wars of other worlds and then try to figure out people's hearts. Therefore, under such circumstances, the Emperor God's horizons had become extraordinary. It was also because of this that the God Emperor sensed a trace of danger from the other side's arrangements. Therefore, he was very worried and insisted on waiting here. Those three little fellows are the future of our Four-Realm Alliance. Nothing can happen to them. At our age, I'm afraid we'll only be like this for the rest of our lives. However, they're different. We have one foot in the grave, so it's fine if we die. They have to live, said Li Fengmu with emotion. The higher the realm, the more difficult it was for Li Fengmu. Regarding the matter of breaking through, if it weren't for the many opportunities and by Jian's light, Li Fengmu definitely wouldn't have reached the realm he had today. Li Fengmu was very clear about this. Therefore, when he came, he had a duty-bound attitude. The God Emperor smiled and shook his head, saying, "You're about to get old, but I'm not. I still have a great future. If someone were to die, it would be you, old thing." Hearing this, Li Fengmu was immediately choked. At the same time, Sword Master Li did not refute at all. He also understood that the God Emperor's talent was not bad for continuously breaking through while he was in seclusion. It was just that he had been enduring it all this time and did not show it. If one were to talk about it, perhaps those three little fellows who were in the limelight might not even be a match for the God Emperor. Thinking about it carefully, the God Emperor had created many legends in the past. It was just that no one had spread it around, so very few people knew about it. In addition, the God realm had been hiding behind the scenes for many years and rarely made a move. It was even harder to find out about his background than to reach the heavens. Under such circumstances, Li Fengmu had no choice but to admit defeat. "I can't compare to you youngsters," Li Fengmu said with a wry smile. Thinking back to those glorious years, Li Fengmu had no choice but to admit that he was old. Time flew by. Now that he was lucky enough to break through a few more realms, it was already a very fortunate thing. The God Emperor only smiled faintly, not taking Li Fengmu's words to heart. Right now, the God Emperor was most concerned about the battle situation in the Inflame world. However, he did not have the means to know the situation over there. Most of what he knew was just his own conjecture. However, it wasn't easy to know the result. However, if there were any changes in the Inflame realm, they could ensure that they could rush over in the shortest time possible to reverse the situation. According to the Emperor God's information, the three experts from the Inflame world were all at the 6th level Martial Emperor realm. They were at the same level as him, so it was not impossible for him to fight them. These little fellows are really arrogant. Li Fengmu sighed. Li Fengmu would never have dared to think of such a bold and reckless style in the past. In fact, he felt that doing so was almost completely disregarding his own life and death. However, this was the beauty of Xiaoyang. He knew that there was danger, but he would not take half a step back. Moreover, he had a way to break it. This was the most terrifying part. Being able to leave a proper escape route for himself was probably the main reason why Xiaoyang could do whatever he wanted. Of course, he also hoped that this escape route would not be used. Once it was used, it could only mean that the situation had become very bad. They are indeed powerful. "We might even be too nervous to come here this time," the God Emperor said indifferently. Up until now, the God Emperor felt that there were many mysteries surrounding Xiaoyang. Moreover, this young man was indeed extraordinary in many ways. If he wasn't confident, why would he take the risk? Li Fengmu only smiled, thinking that the heavy burden of the Four-Realm Alliance was shouldered by these three little guys. He felt gratified and sad. Flying Cloud Mountain. Quang Hung and Meng, who led a group of powerful figures to be stationed here. They had to obey the orders of the Mo family head. This time, they brought not only a few rank 5 experts, but also many other martial royal realm experts. There were more than 1,000 people, all of whom were elites. Such a battle group's combat strength was also very strong. They had all been on the battlefield during the war with the Beast Realm. Their combat strength was even more impressive. Such a battle formation could be said to be ready for battle. It was just to deal with 3 people. This made Quang Hung more or less feel that it was like using a sledgehammer to kill a chicken. However, since the Mo family head had made such an arrangement, he naturally had his reasons. Moreover, he had set up a line of defense at the Furious River behind Flying Cloud Mountain. Those who were stationed there were the remaining elites. Isn't the family head a little too cautious? There are only 3 rank 5 experts. Is there a need to do this? Meng, who muttered unwillingly. Such a big battle formation was also beyond Quang Heng's expectation. Master must have his reasons for doing this. Mo Wu is not a fool to be able to come to where he is today. His judgment has always been good. He rarely misjudges, Quang Hung said. Speaking of Mo Wu, Meng, who was even more unhappy. He still could not let go of what they had done outside of the border. What kind of logic was it to run away before the battle? Could it be that the 3 of them had 3 heads and 6 arms? Even if the 3 of them were said to be invincible in the same realm, they had the advantage of numbers. It was not impossible for them to fight. It was fine to lose, but how could they run away inexplicably? What kind of logic was that? Even though he knew that Bai Jianli had fought with the Sun brothers, Meng, who already felt that the opponents were not as terrifying as he had imagined. As for the Mo family head's caution, it was even more thought-provoking. However, thinking about it carefully, it seemed that the Mo family head had not been so cowardly even when facing the invasion of the beast realm. But now, facing these three juniors, he was so fearful. It was really puzzling. The other rank, 5 martial monarchs, stared ahead. Their fighting spirit was even more brilliant. After suppressing it for so long, they were also yearning and waiting for the arrival of this battle. The resentment in their hearts could only be vented with anger. Chapter 27:19. Quang Hang looked at Meng Hu. This guy was actually a little unconvinced. This was a little laughable. A 5th-level martial king was indeed a powerhouse in the In-Flame world. He could even be said to be a top existence. However, Meng Hu was not so eye-catching among the many 5th-level powerhouses. A wild cultivator who relied on luck to get to where he was today actually dared to question one of the 3 heads of the In-Flame world. If such a statement were to be spread out, it would probably be a huge joke. However, now was the time to join hands to fight the enemy. Naturally, there was no need to be too calculative. In the following battle, everyone would go all out. If anyone held back or caused internal conflicts, it would not be beneficial to the battle. Therefore, it did not matter if they tolerated him a little now. Even if they were displeased, it would not be too late to settle the score after this storm passed. Who are these 3 people? Are they really so powerful? A 5th-level cultivator stood out and asked doubtfully, because the state they were in now was indeed a little nervous. Moreover, there were many 5th-level cultivators in the In-Flame world. Their numbers were enough to crush them a few times. However, it was a little too much to act like this now. Martial Uncle Mo Wu. If you think about it carefully, you will naturally know the pros and cons. Quang Hang shook his head helplessly. The person who asked the question frowned. This sentence was completely saying that they were brainless. Wasn't it a little too much to speak like this? However, Quang Hang's appearance made him even angrier. Could it be that this junior dared to disrespect his elders just because his master liked him? No matter how outstanding Quang Hang was, he was only a disciple. He was an outsider. How dare he offend the elders of the main family? How could he be so arrogant because of his master's favor and not think about how to leave a way out for himself? Martial Uncle Mo Wu, don't be angry. Do you still remember when I fought with Xing Tian? If you didn't act in time, I would have lost my life. Quang Hang said helplessly. Hearing this, Mo Wu's expression became a lot more interesting. Since you still remember these things and speak like this, what are your intentions? Back then, even Martial Uncle Mo Wu was unable to defeat Xing Tian. How could he be certain that he would be able to defeat Xiaoyang, who had defeated Xing Tian through ordinary means? Quang Hang laughed. Such a simple logic could be understood with just a little thought. Why deceive oneself and others? Of course, everyone might have thought of this, but they just didn't want to believe it, so they deliberately avoided some key points. Who was Xing Tian? He was an existence that had suppressed the geniuses of the 2 worlds, and none of them dared to compete with him. Even some old fellows couldn't do anything to him, and even had a headache because of him. After this point was exposed by Quang Hang, everyone's expression immediately became unsightly. The other party was one of the best amongst those at the same cultivation level. In fact, he was even stronger than Xing Tian. How terrifying was his strength! Meng, who merely snorted. Clearly, he was still somewhat dissatisfied with this statement. This was completely boosting the morale of others and destroying their own prestige. His actions were truly incomprehensible and displeasing to the eye. It seems that we really haven't thought about it enough. Mo Wu smiled bitterly and muttered. Thinking about it this way, this battle was indeed worthy of being treated with great caution. Even though there were only 3 of them, they still couldn't be underestimated. If he was the slightest bit careless, he might even lose his life here. However, their goal today was to kill the 3 people from the outer realms. In the end, several almighties would probably die here. This was something that couldn't be helped. How could there be no casualties in a battle? On the other hand, it was a good thing for those mediocre people to be able to leave their positions. It would be good to let those talented disciples fill in the spots. Emo Wu only smiled indifferently. The situation in the Inflame world was about to change. After Quang Hung had lost to Xing Tian, he had learned from the painful experience. After countless years of training, his strength was also not bad. In fact, he was only half a step away from the 6th level martial emperor. Once he broke through to the next level, Quang Hung would find Xing Tian to fight and wash away the humiliation. He didn't expect that someone would appear and defeat Xing Tian before that. If he could kill Xiaoyang here today, his status would probably rise as well. At that time, with his master's favor and support, it was possible for him to become the core figure of the Mo family. Quang Hung seemed to be favored now, but he hadn't been able to touch the real core. Immediately, Quang Hung frowned slightly. He stopped talking and looked ahead. Everyone could already see the vague shape of the airship. They didn't expect that they really had the guts to barge in recklessly. This was rather unexpected. However, Quang Hung didn't find it strange. The other party had a big plan, so they naturally had to take some risks. And this was the reason why they were able to kill him. On the airship, the 3 young people looked very relaxed. They didn't look nervous at all. They were indeed a little nervous before. But in a short time, they had already adjusted their state of mind. Now, they were able to face this battle in a very calm state. Looks like the other party's lineup is not bad. Say, the vanguard is just an appetizer. Do they need to be so extravagant to test us? Bai Jian leaned on the railing and said with a smile, looking bored, there were already several stage 5 powerhouses. As for the martial emperors, there were countless of them. It was obvious that the Mo family had restrained all their strength in a short time. They wanted to fight to the death with the 3 of them. Xiaoyang shrugged and said, it's up to you to believe it or not. The Furious River is the main course. Of course, the appetizer was not simple. If one's teeth were not good enough, it was easy to break one's teeth and choke to death. The other party wanted to know the strength of the 3 of them. So naturally, they had to show a matching strength. In fact, he might even have to suppress them. Otherwise, it would be meaningless to send a few people here. They would just be sending themselves to their deaths. It was impossible to test their strength. If it's just an appetizer, why do we have to make such a big fuss? Bai Jian said helplessly. On the way here, Xiaoyang had already arranged how to fight this battle. He didn't even miss some details. He was very detailed and didn't miss any. Chapter 2720. Bai Jian placed his sword on the railing. Looking at the many powerhouses before him, he could not help but feel his hands itch. However, in this battle, he could not take action without permission. He could only watch from the sidelines. Bai Jian's main task was to be the person holding the fort. He needed to deal with any changes outside of the battle. He could not afford to make any mistakes. If anything were to happen, it would be Bai Jian's responsibility. It was not that Xiaoyang was overly cautious, but that they were in someone else's territory. Without the ability to absolutely crush them, they could only do so. After all, sometimes a small mistake could drag them into a bottomless abyss. Although they had a way out, they could not act recklessly just because of that. After all, what they wanted was not to leave if they could not win, but to defeat the entire Inflame world. Only by doing so could they suppress the people of this world and let them know how powerful they were. Only then would they not dare to act recklessly. If anything were to happen, there would probably be many accidents later on. As such, every step had to be taken well. If they made a mistake, their previous plans would probably be for naught. If your guess is wrong, am I supposed to continue watching? Bai Jian asked helplessly. Xiaoyang nodded with a smile. That was his plan. The battle situation changes rapidly. Once we enter the battle, it'll probably be very difficult to take care of every detail. As such, you'll need to judge for yourself, Xiaoyang said with a smile. Although Bai Jian's personality was rather radical, he was indeed the most suitable person to take on the role in such a situation. If it were someone else, they might not have such a good effect. Every time Xiaoyang made a plan, he would go through repeated reasoning. As such, there were very few problems. Bai Jian nodded. If that was the case, he understood. However, the other side's stance doesn't look simple. They're probably scheming a lot in the dark. Princess Mingzhu said with a deep voice. Of course, they knew even more clearly that the other side's methods were mostly psychological attacks. As the two sides did not know much about each other, many things were in a hazy state. As such, they could only anticipate some possibilities and take precautions. As for the specifics of the situation, they could only come to a conclusion after exchanging blows. There were many possibilities, and all kinds of situations could happen. It was hard to say. The airship was getting closer and closer to Flying Cloud Mountain. Xiaoyang still looked indifferent, but Princess Mingzhu's expression became more serious. Although they had informed the top powerhouses of their respective forces, it would be best if they could rely on their own strength to solve this problem. The expressions of the many almighties on Soaring Cloud Mountain began to change. Some people were very excited, while others were on tenterhooks. They were finally able to fight against the legendary figure. What kind of result would it be? They were all very nervous about this question. After all, it wasn't easy to obtain the final result. A lot of blood had to be paid. I say, you iron bastards, we've been advancing triumphantly and are about to enter your lair. You only dare to show your face now. I thought you guys had already dug 3 feet into the ground and buried yourselves. Bai Jian looked as if he didn't think the matter was big enough and wasn't lively enough. The Mo family's forces had been avoiding the battle from the beginning. Such an action made Bai Jian feel very unhappy. Originally, after entering the Yin Flame realm, as long as they didn't clash with the main forces, Bai Jian would be the one to settle it. In the end, the number of times he fought was pitifully few, and he couldn't enjoy it to his heart's content. Therefore, under such circumstances, how could Bai Jian feel at ease? However, there was no other way. Moreover, he couldn't even fight at this point in time. He had to be the final person to prevent their almighties from backstabbing them. As the existence with the strongest lethality, it was naturally best for him to deal with those troublesome characters. As Bai Jian's words left his mouth, the powerhouses on Soaring Cloud Mountain began to get restless. All of them were impassioned and looked like they couldn't wait to kill the 3 of them. However, Quang Heng didn't give the order, so no one dared to act rashly. What they were doing now was a matter of battle formation, not an ordinary vendetta. Since they had become an army, orders were the most important. Quang Heng looked at the airship getting closer and closer, and the smile on the corner of his mouth increased. Quang Heng wasn't in a hurry to make a move because his master had told him in private before he arrived here. This battle might be very dangerous, and they might not even be able to take down the 3 of them. Therefore, what they needed to do was to attack with all their strength. Even if they couldn't kill them, they had to exhaust their strength and force them to take out all their trump cards. In this way, Quang Heng's goal of being the vanguard would be achieved. He could then lead everyone away and let the next battle begin. Quang Heng was naturally unconvinced in his heart. If he could kill them now, it would be the best thing. The other party is really arrogant. As expected, they're young and impetuous. Mo Wei laughed and said, Mo Wei had seen a lot of these little guys clamoring, so he knew in his heart that there was no need to be angry. In fact, if he was angry, he would be falling into the enemy's trap. You don't even dare to breathe loudly? Such actions made people feel a chill in their hearts. I think in the future, you should change your name to Coward World. This is the most appropriate way. Bai Jian saw that the other party still didn't respond, so he continued to ridicule. Since he might not be able to satisfy his craving later, it was still good to satisfy his craving for words. Anyway, even if these guys were angry, they couldn't vent their anger on him. On the other hand, Xiaoyang held back his laughter. Bai Jian's excuse was indeed a little lame. However, there was almost no lethality, but the insulting effect was extremely high. Sure enough, Some cultivators were so angry that they couldn't even control their aura and began to expose it. At the same time, Xiaoyang was also carefully sizing up the people from Soaring Cloud Mountain. He wanted to see what kind of lineup the Mo family had brought out since they wanted to test them. If he could understand it, then he could have a plan for the next battle. Suddenly, a person seemed to be unable to tolerate this situation any longer. He took the lead and directly left Flying Cloud Mountain, hovering in front of the airship. You outsiders are just talking. You can scare them with some dazzling light, but you can't scare me. Meng, who was fearless, and shouted angrily. Chapter 27-21. Seeing Meng, who taking the lead to rush out, Bai Jian shut his mouth and laughed. Unexpectedly, there were some brainless people in the Yin Flame world. With just a few words, they were provoked to rush out, as if they were ready to fight with their lives on the line. Xiaoyang also laughed. He also knew that Meng, who was a brainless person. Therefore, it was normal for him to be the first to rush out. Meng, who was forthright and had good luck. That was why he had achieved what he had today. However, because he had not experienced much danger, he did not think too much. He looked at problems one-sidedly. Sometimes it was normal for him to stand out and fight just because he felt unhappy. This was a good advantage because he could make friends with this kind of people. However, this was also a fatal flaw. To put it nicely, Meng, who was simple and honest. To put it bluntly, he was brainless. Quang Heng could not help but frown when he saw Meng, who rushing out. This guy really did not know the severity of the situation. They had also made arrangements and had divided the work clearly. However, this guy's rash action had completely destroyed their previous arrangements. Of course, there was a way to remedy it, but Quang Heng felt very upset. Martial nephew, this guy is so impulsive that he will easily ruin things. Since he wants to court death, then let him do it. Why worry in the slightest? Anyway, it doesn't matter whether he's there or not. Mo Wu shrugged and sneered. Meng, who had destroyed the original arrangements. In addition, there were many conflicts between him and the others. Now he did not listen to orders and was stubborn. Therefore, no one was willing to speak up for him. Quang Heng smiled, but did not say anything. At this moment, he somewhat admired Mo Wu. What kind of mentality did he have to accept such a person and become friends with him? At least as far as Quang Heng was concerned, he could not accept having such a stupid friend. It was not good to be brainless. However, if he could not even do the simplest thing of obeying orders, then he was not just brainless. This kind of person had always been arrogant, but he did not know how much he was worth. It was the most ridiculous. In the end, he still felt that he was invincible. It was really funny. No matter what, Meng, who was digging his own grave. What did it have to do with him? Bai Jian, aren't you arrogant? Come out and fight me now. Meng, who said, furiously. As he spoke, the flames on Meng, whose body burned even more fiercely. In the blink of an eye, the flames had covered his entire body, making him look like a man on fire. During this period of time, Meng, who felt extremely aggrieved. At this point, he could no longer tolerate it. He only wanted to fight to his heart's content and then kill all of these fellows. Only then could he vent all the resentment in his heart. Otherwise, if he kept it bottled up in his heart, it would be really unbearable. However, Bai Jian shrugged and said, "A figure like you isn't worthy to exchange blows with me. You are not worth my time." After saying that, Bai Jian even put on an expression that said, "That's how I am." His provocation was even more obvious. You really only know how to flaunt your sharp tongue. However, this battle is not something you can avoid. Since you're here, don't even think about going back alive. Meng, who said, and started to move forward. Facing Bai Jian's avoidance, Meng, who only felt that Bai Jian was afraid of him, which was why he did so. Xiaoyang rushed out directly. With the support of his will, although his aura had not reached its peak, it was already not to be underestimated. This time, Xiaoyang alone was enough to attack the formation. Now was a good time to test out just how much might his true intent myriad forms arts had cultivated to this point. No matter who comes, there is only one result: death. Meng Hu shouted. Now, Meng Hu was blinded by anger. In his opinion, they were all in the same realm. Even if there was a gap, how big could it be? Therefore, as long as he exerted his strength, he could win. Moreover, this was not only the Yin Flame world, but also the Mo family's territory. No matter how he looked at it, he, Meng Hu, had no reason to lose. Seeing Xiaoyang suddenly rush out, Quang Hang frowned slightly. The other party is not simple either. Now that the formation suddenly changed, we also need to change. Fortunately, Meng Hu the spool opened the way for us, so we have the opportunity to return, Mo Wei said with a smile. Quang Hang nodded, but he was thinking about other things in his heart. It could be said that Xiaoyang might be the strongest existence among the three of them. He would most likely be the finale. But now Xiaoyang was the first to attack. This was somewhat unexpected. However, Quang Hang also felt that this was for the best. If he could understand a little more, then his chances of defeating Xiaoyang would be much higher. It would depend on whether Meng Hu, this pathfinder, could have the most effect and force the other party to show some trump cards. However, Quang Hang shook his head and denied it very quickly. With Meng Hu's pig brain, he might be played around by others, still wanting him to probe the depth. That was undoubtedly a fool's dream. Therefore, there was no need to ask for too much. They just had to watch. Being able to understand a general idea was not bad. When do we attack? Mo Wei asked in a low voice. Quang Hang frowned slightly, thought for a moment, and said, "When Meng Hu is defeated, then attack." Mo Wei smiled. He also had the same intention. Some disobedient people who did not know how to restrain themselves should be thrown out of the game as soon as possible. Otherwise, if they continued to act recklessly, it would affect the situation as a whole. Perhaps because of their recklessness, more problems would occur in the future. Now, Meng Hu was still completely unaware of what was happening behind his back, and he had already become an abandoned chess piece in the mouth of others. However, Meng Hu would not think about this. He could not think of these problems at all. "You are Xiaoyang? Outside is full of exaggeration. Why don't you dare to attack?" Meng Hu mocked. Xiaoyang smiled and said, "I see that you still have a lot of last words, so I'll give you some time. Since you're done, that's good." As soon as his voice fell, Xiaoyang directly rushed towards Meng Hu, relying on his will and exquisite body movement. His speed was so fast that it was difficult to capture. Suddenly, Meng Hu's pupils could not help but shrink. He did not expect the opponent's speed to be so fast. Just relying on his eyes, he could barely see the opponent's movements. However, Meng Hu was also a person who had tried his best to fight. Since he could not see, he used his divine consciousness to sense. Immediately, sensing Xiaoyang's specific location, Meng Hu also smiled. Chapter 27-22. Meng Hu growled and dashed toward Xiaoyang at an extremely fast speed. Meng, who looked like a ball of burning flame, his forward momentum was like a long dragon, seemingly unstoppable. At this moment, Meng Hu's eyes were full of determination, because, in his opinion, they were all in the 5th level martial royal realm. No matter how powerful Suemo was, how powerful could he be? They were all afraid of him because they had never seen him but only heard of his battle record. That was a little too aggrieved. Therefore, Meng Hu did not believe in heresy. He wanted to use his fists to fight for a real battle record. He wanted to let the powerful figures in the Yin Flame realm know that the young man they were facing was not an omnipotent monster. They were all cultivators who had comprehended the great Tao of heaven and earth. The gap between them would not be so big. The Yin Flame realm was full of talents. They had many more experts in the same realm than Suemo. As a result, they were all afraid of the slightest thing. They were even ready for battle, using the formation that they had used to deal with Xianjian. Wasn't that making a fuss over a minor issue? At least in Meng Hu's opinion, this was not right, so he needed to change it. He wanted to use his strength to prove that his opponent was not so terrifying. Although they had seen how terrifying Bai Jian's swordsmanship was outside the Yin Flame realm, how could there be so many freaks in a small world? If Bai Jian was really powerful, he would not stand aside and watch the show. Instead, he would let Meng Hu test the situation. Su Mo was also powerful. The Mo family had chosen to withdraw their forces, but Su Mo still dared to swagger in. Meng Hu's behavior was really puzzling. However, in Meng Hu's opinion, this was no longer important because the situation would be revealed soon. In the blink of an eye, the two collided. Meng Hu was immediately sent flying, unable to control himself. Bai Jian shook his head with a smile. Some people were not very strong. They were frogs at the bottom of a well who had never seen the sky. They always thought that everything was the same. Sometimes, even if there was only a slight difference, once it was revealed, it could not be underestimated. Most of the time, that tiny bit of difference was enough to make it difficult for others to overcome. Moreover, Xiaoyang was a ruthless person. Although the things he learned were muddled and messy, he was proficient in everything. This was the most terrifying part. It could be said that he and Princess Mingzhu were easy targets, but Xiaoyang had cultivated many techniques, so it was not easy. On the contrary, he was able to use the techniques he cultivated to deal with his opponent. Princess Mingzhu yawned. She did not care about the battle ahead at all. She continued to drive the flying ship forward. Although it was slow, she would reach Soaring Cloud Mountain before long. Meng, who was just a hothead, with Xiaoyang's strength, killing him was as easy as raising his hand. He did not need to spend much effort at all. If the situation permitted, he could even toy with him until he died. That would depend on whether Xiaoyang had the leisure to do so. On the other hand, Princess Mingzhu was very interested in the layout of Flying Cloud Mountain. After all, there were several powerhouses of the same level there. Since they had chosen to fight on Flying Cloud Mountain, it seemed unavoidable. But in fact, that was not the case. There must be something strange about it. In fact, the murderous intent within it was intertwined with one another. Therefore, they had to be more cautious on this point. At the same time, Princess Mingzhu was also thinking about how to fight the next battle, what kind of situation would occur, and how to deal with it. However, the Mo family's battle strategy seemed to be very simple, and there were no vicious moves. No matter how one looked at the surroundings, all the powerhouses and main forces were on Flying Cloud Mountain, and there were no ambushes around. Soon, Bai Jian seemed to have sensed something and looked above Flying Cloud Mountain. In the next moment, Bai Jian held the hilt of his sword with one hand and looked like he was about to draw his sword. The reason why Bai Jian did not take the lead in this battle and did not move was to guard against the opponent's sneak attack. Unexpectedly, it was as Xiaoyang had expected. The Yin Flame world had racked their brains for this battle, and they had left behind many contingencies. As for these so-called accidents, as long as Bai Jian was watching, they would not happen. Xiaoyang could also charge forward as much as he wanted. No matter what kind of sneak attack came, Bai Jian would cut it down with his sword. Behind Flying Cloud Mountain, there were two people floating in the air, and they were looking down at the battle ahead. Both Mo Jiu and Mo Wu felt a little uneasy, so they came personally to hold the line. If he could find another opportunity to attack, he would be able to kill those people from the outside world and bring this battle to a quick end. That would be the best outcome. Therefore, both Mo Jiu and Mo Wu came. Suddenly, Mo Jiu raised his eyebrows and looked into the distance. He could not help but be shocked. What a strong spirit! Mo Jiu said, and immediately frowned. Mo Wu did not say a word, and his eyes were filled with helplessness. Back then, Mo Wu's realm had regressed because of that person's sword. Bai Jian's sword was extraordinary. Now, Mo Jiu finally understood that the information he received before was true, and Mo Wu's decision to retreat without fighting at the first moment was correct. If he had left too slowly, he would not have been able to leave. The most important thing was to preserve his strength, prepare for the final battle, and reduce unnecessary losses. Mo Jiu looked at Mo Wu with a little more satisfaction. This guy was not only cautious, but also could see the big picture. His eyesight and judgment were not bad. Perhaps the growth of the Mo family's power in the future would be on this person's shoulders. Even if he could not sit on the throne in the future, his effect would not be worse than yours. Your good friend is so reckless. Are you really not going to save him? Mo Jiu suddenly smiled and said, "Things in the future could be dealt with in the future. How to get through the current difficulties was what he, as the head of the family, should think about. Even if the future was wonderful, what future would there be if he fell into the pit right after?" Mo Wu also shook his head helplessly because he felt that this was not easy to do. Thinking about the feelings they had for so many years, he also felt helpless. After so many years, he doesn't even know what kind of person I am. How can he be considered a friend? Mo Wu shook his head and said. Mo Jiu also smiled. His words did make some sense. However, things were not so simple. Chapter 27-23. You have to think carefully. Although Meng, who is not very bright, he is still honest. If you save him this time, he will definitely be loyal to you in the future. If there are any changes, he will listen to you. Moreover, the family behind Meng, who is not bad and can be of help to you, Mo Jiu said with a smile. When Mo Wu heard this, he was stunned for a moment before he recovered his senses. He naturally understood the meaning of the family head's words. If Mo Wu could get more support, he might be able to make further progress in the future. At least he would have more confidence. They won't wake up without seeing blood. Only in this way can those people know how powerful the opponent is and fight with all their might, Mo Wu said. Although this was a great opportunity to subdue Meng, who, in Mo Wu's opinion, it was best to let him die in battle. At least, this would let the powerful people in the Inflame world know that the opponent was so powerful and not just an alarmist. At the same time, Mo Wu felt very helpless. Not to mention the situation in the Wanshou realm. The three of them had their reasons for daring to do so. Moreover, the death of the Sun brothers had already explained many things. However, most of them thought that it was just an alarmist talk. This was the most ridiculous thing. So, he had to use this situation to wake them up and make them sober up. Mo Jiu laughed when he heard this. If that was the case, it would make sense. Sometimes sacrifices were unavoidable. If they died at the right time, there might be a different situation. That's good. You already have the basic qualities to succeed the position. After this matter is over, you can start to take over some things. To be the family head, your strength and realm are just a brick that will make everyone speechless. How to govern a place is the most important thing, Mo Jiu said with a smile. Mo Wu nodded and said, "Thank you for your guidance, family head." Mo Jiu just smiled and did not say anything else. He looked at the battle. Now Mo Jiu was also thinking about how to launch a sneak attack and make the opponent lose one of their iron triangles first. At that time, once one of them had a problem, the opponent's plan would be ruined. At that time, the three of them would not be able to cause any trouble. However, being stared at by that sharp chi, it was difficult for Mo Jiu to attack. If he made a move against Xiaoyang, he was afraid that the sword intent would attack him immediately. Thus, Mo Jiu was also afraid and did not dare to act blindly without thinking. However, Mo Jiu was not anxious at all. Since the Flying Cloud Mountain had already made arrangements, he only needed to continue watching. There was no chance now, but that did not mean that there would be no chance in the future. As long as he was patient, he could wait for a good situation to appear. Mo Wu was the same. Although he did not feel that sharp chi, he did not dare to act rashly when he saw that the family head did not move. On the battlefield, Meng, who was at a complete disadvantage after only 2 rounds of fighting. After the initial collision, there was a problem with the flow of spiritual energy in his body, and the circulation was not smooth. The second time he was punched, several of the bones in his body were broken, and even his meridians became much slower because of it. Meng, who stood there and frowned when he saw that the flames on his body were no longer as powerful as before. Previously, Meng, who did not believe how powerful his opponent was, so he fought fearlessly. However, after exchanging blows, his heart was filled with unbearable pain. Even though they were in the same realm, the strength displayed by his opponent completely crushed him. At this point, Meng, who understood that if he continued to fight, he would definitely die. However, if he retreated now, his opponent would not let him escape so easily. If he turned around and left, he was afraid that his juniors would die faster after being exposed. None of the companions on the flying cloud mountain behind him seemed to be willing to help him. This made Meng, who feel even more uncomfortable. What was going on? Meng, who did not think too much, so he did not know that he had been sentenced to death when he stepped out of the formation without permission. Xiaoyang stood there calmly, as if he did not care at all. It seemed that the previous fight did not raise his spirits at all. Meng, who was strong and unyielding, but the techniques of the Yin Flame realm were not suitable for this word. He was unable to exert his own technique to the limit, and even went in the opposite direction. Therefore, Meng, whose strength was probably at the bottom of the level 5 in the Yin Flame realm. Therefore, it was very easy to deal with him. On the flying cloud mountain, the powerful figures looked at Meng, who coldly, thinking that he had brought this upon himself. Many cultivators were extremely shocked. The strength displayed by this outsider was indeed extraordinary. No matter how they looked at it, it was not a wise choice to make him their enemy. Fortunately, they were well prepared. It was a good thing that they did not rashly start a fight. You were so arrogant before, but why are you acting like a pushover now? Xiaoyang teased Meng, who snorted and did not say a word. Although Meng, who was not very smart, he still knew that in the current situation, he had to admit that he was inferior. The fist was always the best way to speak. Look at your companions behind you. They see that you are no match for them, but they have no intention of helping you. Don't you understand what's going on? Xiaoyang said, curling the corners of his mouth. Meng, who still did not say a word, but his thoughts began to diverge from Xiaoyang's words. It seemed that some things were beginning to become clear. Since they are so heartless, abandoning you and sending you to your death in my hands, why should I be benevolent to them? If you are willing to turn around and leave the Yin Flame realm, I can let you live. Xiaoyang said with a smile. Psychological attack was the best. If he could scare off the powerful figures at the beginning of the battle, the morale of the enemy would be shaken. At that time, the greater the tremors, the faster they would fall apart. Xiaoyang was not in a hurry. He just waited quietly. He had given a choice, so there was no need to force him. Meng, who only glanced back and found that it was indeed as Yan Liqiang said. He was extremely sad. Did these guys really see him as a thorn in their side? Thinking of this, Meng, who felt even more upset and uncomfortable. Since things had come to this, he had no way out. In the next moment, Meng, who charged forward resolutely. He looked extremely miserable. Xiaoyang shook his head and sighed, then attacked again. Chapter 27-24. Xiaoyang gave Meng Hu a choice. Since he chose to die, Xiaoyang could only fulfill his wish. They were enemies, and Xiaoyang carried a blood feud with him. So what if Meng, who was respectable? Their standpoints were such that they had no choice but to do so. Meng, who did not dare to leave rashly because of his family's influence. If he fled at the last minute, with Meng Hu's cultivation, he could find a secluded place in the 3,000 middle worlds and live a carefree life. However, if he really left, then the forces behind him, his family, and his relatives would be put in a difficult position by those sanctimonious fellows behind him. It would be difficult for them to gain a foothold in the entire Yin Flame world. Therefore, Meng Hu could die here, but he could not escape. Xiaoyang naturally knew this, so he felt that although Meng Hu was not smart, he was respectable. Therefore, Xiaoyang would not let Meng Hu go. If he let Meng Hu go because of a whim, would the butcher's knife of the Yin Flame world ever let his people go because of that? A debt of blood must be paid with blood. When it came to battle formations, Right and wrong were naturally unrealistic. The only thing that existed was that the winner was king. Quang Hang, who was on Flying Cloud Mountain, could not bear to see this. It was indeed inappropriate to let such a martyr die. In fact, Quang Hung even began to question whether his previous decision was really the right one. Such an action was not kind. Moa slapped Quang Hang's shoulder and said, "Nephew, how can a man who wants to achieve great things be soft-hearted?" As an old fox who had lived for tens of thousands of years, Moa was used to many things. Even if he were to send a powerhouse of the same level to his death, in his eyes, it was just a small matter. Sometimes, some blood needed to be shed to make the general situation clearer. This way, it was easier to unite the people. When Meng Hu died, the murderer would be the outsider Xiaoyang. The Yin Flame world could unite against a common enemy and work together to kill him. They could even fight to the death. It was not bad to use this method to gather the morale and unite the powerful figures. Even if Meng Hu died, it was a worthy death. He had contributed to the Yin Flame realm. What was wrong with that? Quang Hang smiled and shook his head. He was naturally aware of the pros and cons, but he couldn't help but feel a little reluctant. Quang Hung had studied under his master Mo Jiu for several thousand years. He naturally knew a lot. Regarding some matters, he was even more insightful. However, he was still too young. He was not as insensitive as Mo Hu. Some cultivators had lived for a long time and had seen too many deaths. Their Dao heart would gradually harden. In fact, he would be extremely indifferent to the life and death of others and would not care about it at all. In the end, Quang Hung did not go to rescue Meng Hu. Instead, he ordered all the mighty figures stationed on Soaring Cloud Mountain to get ready for the final battle. Although Meng Hu was brave, it was impossible for him to take on Xiaoyang alone. Therefore, the next encirclement was the most important. On the flying ship, Bai Jian watched Xiaoyang beat up Meng Hu. Then he looked at the motionless Soaring Cloud Mountain. His lips curled into a mocking smile. I didn't expect them to belong to the same force. There is still a gap between them. In this case, they only look united. There isn't much difference between them and the general situation of the beast realm, Bai Jian said disdainfully. Bai Jian did not believe that the other party was an idiot who could not see the situation of the battle. In the end, the reason why they didn't make a move was because they had their own plans. Princess Mingzhu smiled faintly and said, "Isn't it best that they do this? We can take them out one by one and take turns to kill them. This will reduce the risk." Hearing this, Bai Jian laughed awkwardly. This outcome sounded good and was indeed beneficial to them. However, the other party had done this because of some conflicts. However, this kind of problem would be solved. Looking at how quiet Soaring Cloud Mountain was, it was obvious that they had already reached a consensus. Meng Hu was just a sacrifice. "I'm afraid I have to keep an eye on him. It will be difficult for me to take action in the next battle," Bai Jian muttered. Princess Mingzhu nodded and said, "With Xiaoyang at the front, I can just wait for an opportunity to take action." At this moment, Princess Mingzhu's divine consciousness was still going deep. She wanted to go around Soaring Cloud Mountain and see what was going on at the Furious River behind. Xiaoyang had said before that the most important thing might be at the Furious River. If she could find some clues earlier and come up with a countermeasure, it would be much easier. Bai Jian only smiled. However, he kept holding the hilt of his sword. He felt a little helpless. Since the other party did not take action, it was difficult for him to take the initiative to attack. Firstly, it was too far away. Secondly, it would be difficult for the attack to be effective once it was launched. After the other party dodged his sword, trouble would probably arise because of this. Bai Jian had created enough momentum earlier. Now, it was the best choice to use him to intimidate the other party's rascals. Therefore, his specific strength could not be exposed too early. In less than 15 minutes, Xiaoyang directly smashed Meng, whose heart, into pieces with a punch. His sea of consciousness was also shattered, making it difficult for him to continue fighting. Instantly, Meng Hu fell to the ground. Although Meng Hu had not breathed his last, it was impossible for him to survive. Unless a powerful figure saved him with great means and elixirs, there was no way to save him. Looking at the falling Menghu, Xiaoyang shook his head helplessly and said, "It seems that in the entire Yin Flame realm, only this person has some backbone." His words also sounded a little rueful. However, it was more like a slap to the faces of the powerful figures from Soaring Cloud Mountain. Mo naturally heard it clearly, but he did not think it was a big deal. In the end, it was just a battle of words. How could his state of mind be disturbed because of this? Just a few words? How could it be so easy? However, Mo knew very well that, since Meng was gone, they had to cooperate sincerely to kill the three outsiders. If the three of them did not die, it would be difficult for them to survive. Quang Hang waved his hand and said, "Everyone, take your positions!" The battle was close at hand. Quang Hang and the other cultivators were ready for it. In the sky, Maju shook his head, helplessly, and looked at the younger generation. Mo frowned slightly. How could he not be moved when he saw his good friend die in battle? Chapter 27-25. Mo Wu did not feel good in his heart, but with the appearance of this incident, he had already begun to change. Some sacrifices were necessary, and since some people did not listen to his advice, they naturally had to pay the price for it. Otherwise, when he led some people to do things in the future, if they did not listen to his orders, it would be a source of disaster. Therefore, he took this great opportunity to let everyone know that the consequences of not listening to his orders was their own life and death. This was good. After all, the Yin Flame realm still had a long way to go in the future. If everyone acted based on their own emotions, how could they achieve great things? No matter how uncomfortable it was in his heart, Mo Wu would endure it. This was the path that a person had to go through. If one wanted to achieve great things, then they had to pay the corresponding price. No matter how unwilling you were, no matter how unhappy you were, you could only endure it. Sometimes a person's power was very limited. The only thing that could bind people was probably the rules. Looking at the strange expression of his junior, Mo Jio just smiled indifferently. At that time, everyone had walked this path. If one did not experience the wind and rain, how could one have a calm mind to make the best decision? There were some useless things that had to be discarded if they were to be discarded. No matter how Mo Jiu looked at this junior, he liked him more and more. Although Mo Jiu could still live for tens of thousands of years, he could suppress many people to the point that they could not stand out. However, if a person shouldered too many things, then it was inevitable that he would lose many things. After this incident, Mo Jiu would still be the head of the family, the leader of the Mo family. However, a lot of power would be given away. Now that he thought about it, Mo Jiu was also a little envious of the person from the Fire Assembly Union. Although many important things needed his approval, he did not have to worry about those trivial things. Therefore, he could go into seclusion whenever he wanted, without any restrictions. But now Mo Jiu's expression was not good. Although he had discovered some things and figured out some things, he still could not change the situation of the battle now. He could feel that if he were to attack any one of them, that sharp sword would appear in front of him in the blink of an eye. The battle had already begun. Although Mo Jiu wanted to break the balance at an extremely fast speed, he also had to worry about his own state. Mo Jiu had thought it through very clearly. Since they were so powerful, he would use his own subordinates to wear them down. In this way, I'll have a chance to catch all of you in one fell swoop, once I figured out all of your secrets. This battle, in Majo's eyes, was also just like this. Of course, Mo Jiu was able to see further into the future. These three people were probably the strongest in the Four Realms Alliance. If he could kill the three of them here, it would be a piece of cake to take down the Four Realms Alliance. For the other party to rush here in such a hurry, it was likely that they had analyzed the situation clearly, so they had no choice but to do so. Thinking of this, Mo Jiu's heart became much calmer. Everything seemed to be under his control. Even if there were some small waves, as long as he was patient, everything would not be a problem. Therefore, it was better to observe more and plan before acting. That would not go wrong. Mo Wu was also watching the battle. At the same time, he had many doubts in his heart. How did these 3 people dare to do such a thing? Even if the 3 of them were nearly invincible in the same realm, they wouldn't completely underestimate the abilities of the Yin Flame realm. Their actions were really infuriating. At the same time, Mo Wu admired these 3 people very much. Such courage was rare in the world. Xiao Yong hovered in midair. When he looked back, he saw that the flying ship was still moving forward. The smile on his face deepened. They were so domineering that they would continue to push forward. So what if there were only 3 of them? At least in terms of momentum. They had to show that they could overwhelm thousands of troops. Some things could be intimidated by momentum. Once the other party was afraid, they would be utterly defeated. However, it was almost impossible to defeat this group of elites like that. Nevertheless, it was not a problem to suppress their morale. Moreover, if the Mo family forces were defeated in this battle, the entire Yin Flame realm would be shaken. At that time, all the forces in the Yin Flame realm would have to think twice before taking action. Would their actions bring about a disaster to themselves? The power of deterrence was also indispensable. What? You don't even dare to speak now? Xiao Yang sneered. No matter when, it was best to attack mentally. Quang Hung snorted coldly and ignored him. On the contrary, the powerful figures behind him had begun to become very agitated. This kind of humiliation was something they could not bear. If they could, they wished they could charge up now and decide the victor. However, they had seen Meng Hu's ending. How would they dare to act recklessly? If they didn't listen to orders, only death would await them. Moreover, no one would help them. Mo Wu's expression was more natural. These verbal provocations naturally wouldn't move him. You're really good at talking. Mo Wu couldn't help but laugh. Who didn't know how to ridicule in words? Xiao Yang laughed. Looking at the old fox, there was a hint of calculation in his eyes. Since you boast that your ability is invincible, then why don't you dare to enter Flying Cloud Mountain to fight? Quang Hung took a deep breath and said, Now, the formation of Flying Cloud Mountain was already fully operational. Therefore, Quang Hung had confidence and was naturally not afraid. Previously, Quang Hung thought that with everyone joining forces, it was enough to kill 3 people. However, with the previous observation, he felt that it was very wise to choose Flying Cloud Mountain as the battlefield. On their home ground, there were many preparations. Naturally, there was no reason to lose. Mo Wu looked. There was a hint of provocation in his eyes. Xiao Yang was not a fool. Naturally, he could also see that there was something strange in Flying Cloud Mountain. It could be said that Flying Cloud Mountain was an inescapable trap prepared by the Mo family forces for him. If he turned around and went in, he was afraid that he would fall into the enemy's trap. Who says that I don't dare? Xiao Yang sneered and said, even though he knew that it was a trap, Xiao Yang still chose to go in and explore. He wanted to see if this trap was big enough to trap him inside. Nothing ventured, nothing gained. If he wanted to completely destroy their psychological defenses, then he would have to do it according to their ideas. Let the opponent know that those so-called arrangements were useless. Immediately after, Xiao Yang rushed in. Chapter 27-26. When Quang Hang saw that Xiao Yang had actually dashed in, his heart was instantly filled with shock. This guy was really brave. Could it be that he was not afraid at all? Such a person was indeed a terrifying existence. He was worthy of being a person who could fight with Xing Tian. It was not surprising that he had such courage. If he did not come, people would look down on him and think that his battle record was not as good as it seemed. However, now it seemed that the situation he was about to face would become more serious because of this. Mo Wei's performance was different because, in his view, the other party's actions were like walking into a trap. As long as he entered Flying Cloud Mountain, he would have all the advantages in his hands. No matter how brave that guy was, he would feel uncomfortable under such a heavy trap. Even if he was a dragon, he would have to stay in this inescapable trap and would not be presumptuous. Confidence is a good thing, but blind confidence will eventually come with a price. Mo thought in his heart, and his ruthlessness was fully revealed. Originally, Mo Wei thought that he would need to use some tricks to lure him into Flying Cloud Mountain. However, now that he had rushed in himself, it would save him a lot of trouble. To him, it was completely beneficial to him to have everything go according to his wishes. A person's courage was very limited. Xiao Yang's attention did not move away from them. From the subtle changes in their expressions, he could read a lot of information. However, he did not care. Sometimes, in the face of absolute strength, scheming was just fancy. Even though Xiaoyang didn't have the absolute strength to crush them, but in terms of planning and adaptability, he wasn't any worse than them. Therefore, Xiaoyang could be so fearless. Even though he knew that there was a mountain of knives and a sea of fire in front of him, he still had the courage to rush in. Now, it was Bai Jian who felt great pressure. Now that Xiaoyang had rushed in, he looked very confident, but the pressure fell on him. Bai Jian was already struggling to keep an eye on the person in the dark. Now that Xiaoyang had taken the initiative to rush into the tiger's den, Bai Jian naturally had to spend more energy. In fact, even the slightest mistake could not be made. It could be said that if any of the three of them were to encounter any problems, it would be difficult for them to move forward. Princess Mingzhu was still driving the airship forward, as if she had no intention of stopping. It was as if, in her eyes, this was nothing more than an ordinary matter. In terms of aura and pressure, they did not fall into a disadvantageous position. They controlled it extremely well. It could be said that as long as the airship did not stop moving forward, the pressure that the many mighty figures on soaring Cloud Mountain would feel would increase. However, at this speed it would only take the time for an incense stick to burn before the airship entered the soaring Cloud Mountain. They had calculated all of this extremely well. Even though there were some changes in the situation, Princess Mingzhu still appeared to be unhurried, as if she had already calculated everything. He had absolute trust in his companion's abilities, as if nothing could go wrong. Mo also noticed this detail, so his smile suddenly froze. For a moment, this old man really couldn't figure out what these little guys were scheming in their hearts. There were many doubts here, and for a while he couldn't come to an accurate conclusion. But the arrow was already on the bow, and it had to be shot. How could they have extra time to worry? In the blink of an eye, Xiaoyang had also rushed into the soaring Cloud Mountain. After entering the soaring Cloud Mountain, the scene in front of Xiaoyang's eyes had also undergone earth-shaking changes. The green mountains and clear waters that he originally saw had become desolate at this moment. On this mountain, there was not the slightest trace of life, not even a leaf could be seen. There were withered rocks everywhere, and there were many thin cracks on the mountain. Some smoke was constantly rising, gathering together and looking like clouds. This mountain looked like a dried-up volcano. However, it was different from a volcano. The feeling that it gave people here was indeed lonely and cold. The mountains of the Inflame world had always been like this, because the core power of their world was like that. Therefore, no matter where it was, it would be greatly affected. I didn't expect you to have the guts to break in. Kuang Heng sneered. In the next moment, Kuang Heng clasped his hands together, and suddenly, the mist on the mountain rose up and finally gathered on his body. It was as if the luck on the soaring Cloud Mountain was poured into his body. Just this little trick? Xiaoyang still had a look of disdain. It was as if the changes in front of him didn't make him feel anything. Everything, in the end, was just within his expectations. Borrowing the power of your companions and the characteristics of this soaring Cloud Mountain to temporarily let you have the power of a 6th-level Martial King is indeed a good plan. Xiaoyang walked forward step by step, as if he was taking a leisurely stroll. At this moment, Kuang Heng's brows slightly furrowed. I think you're naturally no match for Xingtian. He lost to me, and you alone. Even if you have the power of a 6th level, I'm afraid it's not enough. As for the one watching the show in the sky, He's a genuine 6th level. If you guys join forces, you really have a chance to take me down." Xiaoyang said with a smile of ridicule. When these words came out, not only Quang Hang, but even Mo Jiu, who was waiting in the sky, couldn't help but be shocked. He originally thought that he was only discovered by Xiaoyang, but he didn't expect that Xiaoyang had been guarding against him all along. But why did he want to say it out loud now? This was really thought-provoking. Even though Mo Jiu had some thoughts in his mind, he wouldn't act rashly. Until now, he was very clear about why he had made such a big fuss. Since he had already decided on something, there was naturally no need to change it. Moreover, sometimes it was right to be open-minded. Amazing, as expected of someone who could defeat Xingtian. Quang Hang said with a smile. Now, Quang Hang finally believed that the opponent in front of him was indeed not to be underestimated. But we're having a big battle, not a spar. If I want to kill you, I'll do it at all costs, Quang Hang said. In Quang Hang's opinion, it had been hundreds of years since his battle with Xingtian. During this period of time, both of them had changed. Quang Hang was cautious and conscientious, and worked hard to cultivate every day. How could he say that he was definitely weaker than Xingtian now? In Quang Hang's opinion, Xingtian's defeat was probably because he had slacked off in his cultivation during this period of time. That was why he ended up like that. The situation was no longer the same as before. Chapter 27:27. At present, Quang Hang had powerhouses of the same sect, using Flying Cloud Mountain as a medium to provide him with endless power. His power was even more powerful than before. There were even some powerhouses around waiting for an opportunity to make a move. If Xiaoyang revealed a flaw, then they would make a move. At least for now, Quang Hang was still relatively confident. Taking down such an arrogant person was naturally not a problem. Xiaoyang smiled and shook his head, saying, "Some things can't be smoothed out by relying on external forces. The more you rely on these, the more it shows that you're just like that." When saying this, Xiaoyang appeared very indifferent, as if he had already sentenced his opponent to death. Quang Hang snorted coldly. He also wanted to ignore such provocation. However, he was already so powerful now. Could it be that he still had to endure this anger? Therefore, Quang Hang felt that it was unreasonable. No matter how much you say, it's just a battle of the tongue. "Let's see who's the real deal with our fists," Quang Hang said in a deep voice with furrowed brows. Now that the great enemy was in front of him, Quang Hang already did not have much patience. He knew that his master was watching from above. If his performance was poor, he would probably receive less attention in the future. If his performance could satisfy the old man, it was even possible for him to completely integrate into the Mo family. If he could not integrate into the Mo family, even if he was at the center of power, he could not touch it. It could be said that this was also something that Quang Hang had always minded in his heart. Since there was a great opportunity to prove himself, then he could not miss this great opportunity. Xiaoyang saw some additional emotions in Quang Hang's eyes and knew that this guy still had more thoughts. These would all become his weak spots. However, in the next moment, Xiaoyang was slightly moved because those clouds seemed to have given birth to spiritual intelligence and surged toward him crazily. Flying Cloud Mountain was now under Quang Hang's control. Therefore, he could use everything on this mountain as he pleased. This was also the reason why he did not take half a step out of Flying Cloud Mountain and forcefully left the battlefield here. Their Mo family forces had never faced a head-on battle. After enduring for so long, how could they not have made any preparations? These were the gifts that they had prepared for the 3 outsiders in the past 10 days. If the other party swarmed into Soaring Cloud Mountain at the same time, Quang Hang would find it difficult to deal with them. However, the safest way to deal with them was to take them out one by one. Looking at the gathering dark clouds, Xiaoyang was not afraid. With a low roar, he punched out. Immediately, the dark clouds that arrived first were shattered by this punch, turning into countless gray flames that scattered on the ground. However, Xiaoyang raised his fist and frowned when he saw the burn marks on his skin. Flying Cloud Mountain was indeed a little strange for him to be burned even though he didn't feel any pain. Moreover, this kind of attack that didn't cause any pain was very deadly. It was impossible to guard against. If he was the slightest bit careless, he might not even realize that he was heavily injured and would be silently burned to the ground. Thinking of this, Xiaoyang had to immediately restrain his mind. He immediately pulled out the Thunder Fire Divine Sword and waved it continuously. Sword Qi was everywhere. Since he couldn't touch it with his body, he could only use Sword Qi to break the dark clouds. Otherwise, the consequences would be extremely terrifying if they continued to attack. Quang Heng saw everything with his eyes. He could also read a lot of information from the other party's methods. This also let Quang Heng know that he could not be careless in the future. Otherwise, the consequences would be unimaginable. They were already standing opposite each other. It could be said that there was no way to avoid it. Of course, this place was the most suitable battlefield for him. Quang Heng had no reason to retreat. He directly rushed over. Quang Heng had too many advantages in this battle. He also knew that he had to end the battle quickly and then deal with the other two. That was the right thing to do. Mo Wei stood aside. He knew that this was Quang Heng's home ground, so he did not intend to make a move. However, he still made some preparations. If an opportunity really appeared, he would naturally make a move. In order to kill him quickly, he naturally could not give him a chance to breathe, so as to avoid future troubles. In the blink of an eye, Xiaoyang had almost broken the strange dark clouds around him, but he had no place to stand. The ground was full of gray flames. Once contaminated, he was afraid that he would quickly burn. The most fatal thing was that he would lose his body and life without being aware of it. Under such circumstances, Xiaoyang had no choice but to be extremely cautious. Now, Xiaoyang also understood that Quang Heng made these dark clouds seem to be making meaningless attacks, but the purpose was to gradually encroach on the space he could play. Good method. Xiaoyang suddenly shouted in a low voice, and immediately rushed out with the divine sword in his hand. Since Quang Heng was able to plot against him from every angle, and even gave him a small advantage, Xiaoyang could not drag this out any longer. The longer this battle dragged on, the less space Xiaoyang had to display his skills. On the contrary, the other party would become like a fish in water and have no scruples. Xiaoyang was still clear about the problem here and knew what he should do. Quang Heng saw the other party coming, and the corners of his mouth showed a sneer. What? You're going to do something desperate now. Quang Heng thought and felt a little proud. The other party's calmness was just a pretense. If you want to be arrogant in other people's territory, you have to pay the price. Quang Heng's hands were constantly changing, and suddenly the flames on his body began to burn, but it looked very strange. The combination of green and gray created something that looked a little strange. The next moment, Quang Heng directly shot out his palm, and suddenly a palm print was shot out. As this palm print rushed forward, it was constantly absorbing the power of the Flying Cloud Mountain, and countless gray flames gathered to strengthen the power of this palm print. The current Quang Heng was really in the right place at the right time. The current battle situation was extremely disadvantageous for Xiaoyang at the moment. No matter where he was in an absolute disadvantage. The Flying Cloud Mountain could be said to be where Quang Heng's territory was. Because of this, Xiaoyang was restricted in every way. He had to be careful with every move he made. Seeing the palm print coming, Xiaoyang raised his divine sword and slashed down. It was only the environment that was unfavorable to him, but he was fine. Chapter 27-28. When Xiaoyang entered the territory of Soaring Cloud Mountain, gray smoke rose from the mountain as if it covered the sky. It was impossible to see what was going on inside. In the blink of an eye, the entire Soaring Cloud Mountain was shrouded in gray smoke. It was almost impossible to see with the naked eye. Moreover, the gray smoke could burn one's divine consciousness. It was not easy to pry into it. Bai Jian's expression changed drastically. If they could not see what was going on inside, how could they deal with it if something unexpected happened? Moreover, Xiaoyang was alone in soaring Cloud Mountain. It was still unknown what was going on. Now, Bai Jian finally understood why the Mo family had been holding back and did not do anything. It was so that they could carefully plan every detail and wait for them to jump into the trap. Although they had thought of such a situation before, no matter how they looked at it, they had fallen into the trap because they were bold. Thinking of this, Bai Jian could not help but feel a little depressed. If they could see what was going on inside, they could react immediately. However, there was nothing they could do now. It was a terrible feeling. However, the handsome young man still did not act rashly. He knew very well that if he really rushed in, it would mess up the current situation. By then, there would be no one watching the Almighty in the sky. Something else might happen, and the situation might become more pessimistic. Should we continue like this? Bai Jian frowned and asked in a deep voice. Princess Mingzhu nodded indifferently. It was as if everything that had happened did not affect her emotions at all. It was as if everything was within her expectations. Seeing how indifferent Princess Mingzhu was, Bai Jian smiled helplessly. These guys seemed to be extremely calm no matter what they did, no matter how big the risk was. It was not easy to maintain such an attitude. As long as we don't change, they will be the ones panicking, Princess Mingzhu said after taking a look at the situation. Although she could not see anything, Princess Mingzhu trusted Xiaoyang very much. She felt that as long as he did not ask for help, everything would still be under his control. If they acted rashly now, it would only mess up the plan. At that time, he would only be a hindrance. Bai Jian smiled rather helplessly. However, his senses of the soul and sword intent did not move at all. They were still aimed at the person watching from the sky. Speaking of which, with the two of them holding the rear, Xiaoyang only needed to charge forward. If an accident really happened, they were still considered outsiders and could quickly respond to it. Although they couldn't see the exact situation on soaring Cloud Mountain, they could still sense some things through the explosion of power. Since Xiaoyang could still fight bravely, it meant that he could still handle it. See, I told you that they would be the anxious ones. As Princess Mingzhu spoke, she pulled out her treasured sword and stood horizontally. In soaring Cloud Mountain, there were countless figures appearing continuously. Mo Wei led a group of elite warriors to appear from the gray mist. Their number was huge. Good fellow, there are only 4 experts at the same level. Are you looking down on us? Bai Jian laughed. Back then, outside the Inflame realm, there were already 6 stage 5, but now there were only 4 of them. This was more or less not enough. Princess Mingzhu did not say a word because she saw that there were still many cultivators pouring out from soaring Cloud Mountain. Since the other party had been meticulously planning for so long, they naturally had their reasons. No matter what kind of move they made, they must have thought it over and over again. In comparison, it was very advantageous to them. Otherwise, they would not dare to change it easily. Moreover, among these cultivators, there were not only martial emperor realm experts, but also some elite King Wu. Bai Jian's smile suddenly froze. From the other party's lineup and response, he could feel that something was wrong. It would not be easy to deal with them. Thinking of this, Bai Jian felt a little helpless. In order to deal with the 3 of them, these guys had really racked their brains and used all kinds of methods. But would their plan really work? Mo Wei looked gloomily at the flying ship that was still moving forward. His expression became much uglier. He had received Kuang Heng's order to bring the elites to maintain soaring Cloud Mountain. His goal was to take down the flying ship that was still moving forward. Mo Wei was also clear that the battle on soaring Cloud Mountain would not end in a short while. Moreover, if these 2 people were really allowed to enter soaring Cloud Mountain again, once the 3 of them met up, he did not know what would happen. Therefore, the right thing to do was to cut off all their thoughts as soon as possible. Yonging, take the people and charge into the first formation, Mo Wei ordered. In the next moment, a middle-aged man walked out and began to mobilize the troops to charge toward the flying ship. This time, Yong-ing led more than 100 people. Although their realms were uneven, they were all elites. However, they were definitely elites, and their combat strength was very impressive. Everyone's fighting spirit was very high. Previously, because they had been suppressed for too long, they now needed a good opportunity to erupt. Right now, it was a great opportunity. The cultivators of the Inflame realm could be said to be furious at this moment. It was as if they wanted to trample the flying ship into pieces. Princess Mingzhu only slashed out with her sword. Immediately, a bright sword light shone endlessly. At the same time, countless sword chi sprinkled down like a drizzle. Hearing the screams below, Mo Jiu was still expressionless. Mo Wu seemed to be a little reluctant. He could see that these elites charging at the first formation would only be courting death. Because the opponent had not made a move before, he could be said to be at his peak. When he displayed his cultivation, it was naturally extraordinary. Killing low-level cultivators was naturally easy. This kind of suicidal charge was not meaningless. It could consume the opponent's strength to a large extent. Once it went on for a long time, the opponent would gradually be exhausted and problems would arise in their defense. Once a flaw appeared, the two almighties would only end up being trampled to death amidst the thousands of soldiers and horses. No matter how strong one was, in the face of such a valiant army, one would not be able to overturn it with one's own strength. Unless one had the ability to change the battle situation with a raise of one's hand, it was really possible to form a situation where ants could bite an elephant to death. This was the simplest calculation, using the most clumsy method to defeat the opponent. Chapter 27-29. Looking at those brave warriors of the same race rushing to their deaths, Mo Wu didn't feel good in his heart. However, he also understood that if he gathered all the rank 5 experts to attack together, they would achieve their goal. However, their losses would not be small by doing so. A 5th-order Martial King Realm expert needed a long time to be nurtured. However, no matter how one looked at it, it was much simpler. It could be said that in the Inflame world, rank 5 martial emperors were almost at the top of the pyramid and still needed to be well protected. Once there was a loss, it would become immeasurable. Although Mo Wu could not bear it, he did not speak to stop such an attack. After all, it was still acceptable to sacrifice their lives for a victory. If they lost too many of their top almighties, their forces would decline as a result. The Inflame world looked united, but they secretly wanted to unify. However, because of the invasion of the Beast Realm, and because of their own casualties, they did not dare to act rashly. Once the two forces fought, the one who stayed out of it would be able to benefit. It was also because of this that they could maintain the current balance of power. In the face of the invasion of the Beast Realm, they could show incomparable unity. However, since the army of the Beast Realm retreated, the existing cracks began to appear. Thinking of this, Mo Wu felt a headache coming on. It seemed that leading a force to prosperity was not an easy task, no matter how he looked at it. Mo Jiu felt very annoyed at this moment. He wanted to try, but the sharp sword intent seemed to follow him like a shadow. That kind of pressure made him not dare to act rashly. At the same time, Mo Jiu did not understand. The other party was only a rank 5 expert. Why was he so afraid? No matter how he looked at it, it did not make sense. Therefore, Mo Jiu was very depressed. Could it be that this was the so-called youthful vigor? Even so, it did not make sense. However, these 3 people had not been reasonable since they came to the Inflame world. Mo Jiu smiled bitterly. He was also very patient and was not in a hurry. Anyway, he had prepared for so long and had plenty of patience. He was not afraid that the 3 of them would not show any flaws. Once an opportunity appeared, Mo Jiu would be able to grab it immediately and send the 3 of them away. On soaring Cloud Mountain, 2 youths stood facing each other. Their expressions were different. Xiao Yang stood with his sword in hand, suspended in midair, as if he had an indescribable spirit. On the other hand, Quang Hang was different. There was an additional sword scar on his face. In the confrontation just now, Quang Hang had suffered a sword strike, which was why there was this scar. It was also because of this that Quang Hang realized that if he allowed those two people outside to enter Soaring Cloud Mountain and join forces, the consequences would be unimaginable. At that time, even if there was an inescapable net in Soaring Cloud Mountain, a hole would be pierced through. If one Xiaoyang was already so tyrannical, then the jade-faced youth who had revealed his ability and the girl who had yet to make a move were all unknown mysteries. Therefore, it would be best if he could control the risks in his own hands. The current Quang Hang could be said to be extremely uncomfortable. Although he had suffered a loss in the previous confrontation, Quang Hang still felt that he had the upper hand and could fight. The current situation was very clear. He, Quang Hang, could make countless mistakes and be knocked down several times. However, as long as Xiaoyang made one mistake, he would be buried in Soaring Cloud Mountain. A wisp of dark green flame swept across, and the sword scar on Quang Hang's face quickly disappeared. "You are indeed very powerful," Quang Hang said sincerely. Seeing once was better than hearing 100 times. How powerful was the opponent? Rumors were ultimately just rumors. One would only know how powerful the opponent was after a real fight. Now, Quang Hang did not dare to underestimate him in the slightest. Even his previously inflated ego was completely suppressed. He was very clear that he had to be very careful and cautious in every move he made. Xiaoyang's power was not only domineering in terms of strength. This person's unreasonable attacks also made people afraid and did not dare to be careless in the slightest. Xiaoyang held the divine sword horizontally, and a smile appeared on the corner of his mouth. He said, "You seem to have the upper hand, but in the end it's just SOO." Quang Hang was extremely angry when he heard this. However, he also knew that it was useless to be angry now. Moreover, the opponent did have the right to be arrogant. It was hard to imagine that these three monsters could be so powerful because they had bet all the luck of the 3,000 small worlds on them. Among the younger generation of the 3,000 small worlds, the three of them were the strongest. How could they be simple? Although in the big picture there were not as many small worlds as middle worlds, how could the people who could reach the top be ordinary? Moreover, it was much harder to reach the martial emperor realm in the 3,000 small worlds than in the middle world. "If that's all you have, even with the support, I'm afraid you are no match for me," Xiaoyang said with a smile. It was not that Xiaoyang was arrogant, but that he really thought so. It could be said that Xing Tian was the strongest opponent he had encountered in the middle world. This was because Xing Tian was very powerful in terms of both his skills and his fighting ability. As for Quang Hang, he could not be underestimated. Although he was not very capable himself, he was good at using the environment to strengthen himself. He was also a terrifying opponent. Quang Hang did not speak. He merely snickered and clasped his hands together. Instantly, the entire flying cloud mountain was blown away. Using words to fight for oneself was the stupidest thing to do. Therefore, the only thing Quang Hang could do was to display his capabilities. Since the beginning of time, the fastest and best way to earn respect was to use one's fists. In the world of cultivation, whoever's fists are bigger has the right to speak. When one was in a disadvantageous position, the words of justification or rebuttal that one uttered were like jokes and unrealistic. Therefore, Quang Hang's desire to win was very strong. There was no need to hide some of his techniques. He just needed to make a move. Even if he cannot defeat Xiaoyang, as long as he can create an opportunity for the one who is watching from above to make a move, his chances of winning would be very high. The process of a battle was not that important. The result was what everyone cared about the most. Therefore, as long as he kills Xiaoyang, this storm will be settled. And he, Quang Hang, would also benefit from this. The Seal of the Three Flames. Chapter 2730. Quang Hang shouted in a low voice. His hand seals changed constantly. Suddenly, the atmosphere on Flying Cloud Mountain became tense and hostile. It was as if every corner was filled with battle intent and was about to explode. That kind of nervous feeling caused the atmosphere to become even more strange. Waves of powerful chi fields were like hurricanes, whistling and howling, forming countless tornadoes that tore the young man in the air until he was torn to pieces. Xiaoyang, on the other hand, stood with his sword held horizontally. At the same time, he was guarding his heart. At the same time, wherever his gaze landed, his mind would quickly analyze the situation. From this tense and strange atmosphere, Xiaoyang couldn't help but pay more attention to it. A cultivator's instincts were very important. Now that he felt afraid, Xiaoyang could not help but pay more attention. Perhaps there would be a big change in the next moment. Although Quang Hung could rival a 6-stage powerhouse, he was still not to be underestimated when he was not as strong as Xing Tian. After all, Xing Tian was arrogant and only wanted to use his own ability to determine who was better. But Quang Hung was different. He would do anything as long as he could achieve his goal. In an instant, countless flaming sword chi appeared around Xiaoyang. They intertwined as if they wanted to get rid of all the gray flames. It could be said that the gray flames had always been a hidden danger. If he was not careful, he would be in trouble if he was contaminated. At the same time, there were streaks of lightning around Xiaoyang, forming a second line of defense. In the next moment, Quang Hung suddenly roared and shook his hands. Suddenly, 3 green flames appeared behind him, intertwining and surging. The 3 flames were like giant pythons, complementing each other. The momentum of the attack was even more tyrannical. Seeing the green flames coming, Xiaoyang did not hesitate and rushed forward with his sword. Xiaoyang could feel that the power of this move was terrifying. It would be best if he could break it as soon as possible. If he waited until his opponent had completely mastered the move before attacking, he would be looking for trouble. Therefore, he was very clear about which was more important and which choice to make. However, after the 3 giant pythons appeared, they seemed to have received the recognition and help of this world. In the blink of an eye, they became extremely huge and powerful. Xiaoyang could only laugh bitterly. This was completely Quang Hang's personal domain. No matter what kind of attack was launched, it would be strengthened. It was truly terrifying. No matter how one looked at it, it was not a wise choice to fight him head-on. Move like thunder! Xiaoyang shouted in a low voice. His figure flashed, and he arrived directly on top of a giant python, slashing it down. Instantly, countless streaks of lightning sword chi rained down, and the violent power directly sliced the giant python in half. However, the gray flames and mist in the surroundings continued to rise as if they wanted to repair the python. However, countless strands of sword chi continued to move about, grinding away at the python. Quang Hang couldn't help but frown when he saw the scene. He didn't expect Xiaoyang to be so tyrannical. He was actually cut in half by this sword. However, even so, what could he do? Although Xiaoyang had cut down 1 giant python, the other 2 were already in place and entangled with each other. They seemed to want to trap Xiaoyang in it and strangle him to death with their bodies. Moreover, the flames burning on the giant python's body would probably burn the person trapped in it to ashes before he was strangled to death. Quang Hang's mouth also revealed a trace of a smile. He had used such a method to cause many experts of the same realm to suffer losses. He had even killed several powerhouses from the Wanshou realm. This method could be said to be tried and tested. Xiaoyang was indeed tyrannical, but he was too confident. It was also because of such confidence that he dug his own grave. Of course, Quang Hang also knew that it was a little whimsical to want to kill Xiaoyang in this way. However, it was a great thing to be able to seriously injure him. Once his combat ability was weakened, then there was no need to worry. Trapped between the 2 giant pythons, even if the flames rose, he still didn't feel the burning sensation. However, the cold aura made him feel as if he was in a world of ice and snow. Moreover, Xiaoyang also felt that the layer of wool covering his body was constantly being worn down. Without thinking, he knew that those gray flames were burning. It was also because they were silent and undetectable that it was impossible to guard against them. Fortunately, Xiaoyang was a little more cautious and was prepared for this. Good method. Xiaoyang thought so in his heart. As he watched the space being squeezed smaller and smaller, the pressure on him also increased. This Quang Hang could be considered a cunning old fox. Even in every detail, he had calculated very well. This method might not look so strong, but it was very effective. Moreover, it could also greatly restrict him. Quang Hang's smile also became wider. He manipulated the gray flames on Flying Cloud Mountain and formed an attack, preparing to completely defeat him with this attack. Every part of the plan could be said to be perfect. This was also the biggest difference between Quang Hang and Xing Tian. In a battle, Quang Hang would use all means to win. As long as there was a slight chance, he wouldn't miss it. Plunder like fire! Xiaoyang roared and immediately shook the divine sword in his hand. Immediately, countless flaming sword qi overflowed like a blooming crabapple flower. Since he was already surrounded, he could only use this method to break out. Even if it was a competition of strength, he wouldn't lose. The power contained in his spirit meridians was extremely strong. Even if it was released wantonly, it would be able to last for a long time. This could be said to be a competition between Yang Fire and Yin Fire. Although they were both flames, the two attributes were completely different. One gave people warmth, while the other made people's hearts tremble. It was extremely uncomfortable. Quang Hang's smile suddenly froze. When he felt the scorching aura, his eyes instantly became much fiercer. He hadn't expected Xiaoyang to have such talent. The physical skills that he had displayed previously could be said to be tyrannical. He had beaten Meng Hu so badly that he couldn't raise his head. Then, the thunderous sword was even more domineering. Now, he had even displayed the flaming sword qi. How much ability did he have? As such, Quang Hang really couldn't see through him. The amount of knowledge this person had learned was truly breathtaking. Of course, the most shocking thing was that he was proficient in it and could use it freely. This was the most terrifying thing. The flaming sword qi continued to overflow. Under such an attack, the giant python disappeared at an extremely fast speed. Even countless gray flames were extinguished because of it. The sword qi continued to be extinguished, and the giant python also continued to disappear. The two forces attacked and cancelled each other out. Chapter 27:31. Grandpa, we have already lost more than 20 martial emperors and hundreds of 9th stage King Wu. If we continue to fight like this, our losses will only increase, a young man said anxiously. Mohu, who was standing to the side, looked serious and cold, because in his opinion, these losses were nothing. There was no need to take it to heart. Moreover, this was only the beginning of a great battle. They would only lose more people. It was not an easy task to kill them while preserving one's own life. If one did not pay a certain price, how could it be possible? Moreover, Mo also discovered that such a strong attack could not stop the airship at all. The airship was moving at the same speed as before, and it was moving at the same speed now. This time, he came out to stop the airship from entering Flying Cloud Mountain. However, he lost a lot of people, and the final result was not satisfactory. Mohu also had a headache about this. It seemed that it was almost impossible to stop the airship without putting in some effort. When Mohu turned around, all the 5th stage experts subconsciously avoided him. They might not have known how powerful these people were before, but after seeing these people's methods, they already understood that whoever went out first would have a very high chance of dying. So far, it was still the woman who attacked, and the young man with the jade face looked like he was watching a show. Once, the soldiers under their command were already close to the airship, but that man was still as immovable as a mountain. It was as if the current battle had nothing to do with him. It was hard to imagine how terrifying it would be if that young man who had come from the southern battlefield with an imposing aura, made a move. "May I ask who dares to lead the team?" Mohu asked loudly. The fifth stage experts, standing behind, looked at each other. In the face of such a task, they really did not dare to accept it. At least in their opinion, they could still use the lives of low-level martial emperors. As long as they waited for the woman to lose more than half of her strength, it would be a good time for them to attack. On the contrary, the young man standing beside Mohu was somewhat dissatisfied because he had seen too many of his friends die in vain. How could he not feel distressed? However, when he saw his grandfather's indifferent look, he felt very angry. He really couldn't understand what was the point of such a suicidal attack. Seeing that no one stood up, Mo felt a little helpless in his heart. Speaking of which, everyone was a sly old fox. They were well aware that if they rushed forward, they would be courting death. Who would be willing to stand out? However, if everyone remained in a deadlock and waited for an opportunity to appear, it wouldn't be long before the other party entered soaring Cloud Mountain. As he thought about this, the pressure in Mu's heart increased. Looking back at the flying ship, Princess Mingzhu kept swinging her treasured sword, and countless sword qis rained down. The sword qi was extremely overbearing. Any cultivator below the martial emperor realm would be killed instantly. Even a martial emperor would not be able to take advantage of such a powerful sword qi. Princess Mingzhu was also like this. She was certain that the Type 5 divine warrior would not make a move easily. Hence, she used these martial techniques with a large area of effect to kill these warriors who came to seek death. However, by doing so, the spiritual energy in her body would be consumed very quickly. Looks like the other party came prepared. They are prepared to use this method to drag us to our deaths. Bai Jian said with a helpless smile on his face. Princess Mingzhu only nodded slightly. Although they knew this was the case, they could only continue to pretend that they did not know and kill the warriors who came flocking over. Of course, they also secretly took some pills to recover their spiritual energy, but there were still some limitations to this kind of recovery. The other party is very patient. Until now, they have not made any rash moves, Bai Jian continued. In terms of killing power, he, Bai Jian, was naturally the strongest. However, he had to keep an eye on the person in the sky and did not dare to make a move. Princess Mingzhu nodded. She also understood what Bai Jian wanted to say. It was nothing more than that he could not help to reduce the pressure. As long as you can keep an eye on that person. So what if you don't make a move? Princess Mingzhu said. It could be said that the only person who could change the situation of the battle was the Almighty, who was watching the battle from the sky. If he were to change his strategy, then the situation of the battle would change drastically. Of course, if that happened, many accidents would occur. In many uncontrollable situations, more possibilities would arise. Bai Jian only smiled bitterly. He also felt bored now. Everyone was restraining each other like this. It was really a little uncomfortable. This time, only 3 of them came to the Enflame world, but only 2 of them could really make a move. The Enflame world and the Myriad Beast world are really different, Bai Jian sighed. Looking at the warriors rushing to their deaths dauntlessly, Bai Jian also felt a little emotional in his heart. If this was the Myriad Beast world, it would definitely not work. Slowly wearing down their strength like this did not seem to be of much use, but it could subtly change the situation of the battle. This was also the key reason why Bai Jian absolutely could not make a move. If he were to make a move, his strength would be depleted, and the Almighty from the Mo clan would probably take advantage of the situation to attack. Since everyone wants to watch from the sidelines, then this old man will have to personally make a trip, Mo was said with a smile. Seeing that the losses were constantly increasing, but the gains were negligible, he naturally found it difficult to remain indifferent. There were some things that required people to stand up. Elder, how can you personally take the risk? At this moment, a person stood up and asked hesitantly. Mo would just smiled indifferently. What else could he say about this? However, this sentence made those stage 5 powerhouses who were not part of the Mo family feel like they were sitting on pins and needles. Since Mo Wu, as the commander of this battlefield, had personally charged into the battle, if anything happened to him, they, who were not part of the Mo family, would be held accountable and would not have a good ending. Therefore, they could no longer remain calm and asked to fight. It wasn't a big deal for him to make a mistake, but if something were to happen to this old man, it was likely that the family members behind him would inevitably be criticized. Suddenly, Princess Ming Zhu frowned slightly and took out a sword from her storage bag. Seeing the stage 5 Almighty charging over, she directly pulled out the sword. Immediately, the sword light was resplendent and incomparably dazzling. Chapter 2732. The dazzling sword light flashed and disappeared. Mo Wu saw a level 5 powerhouse run back to the formation with serious injuries. Mo Wu rubbed his eyes in disbelief. He wondered if his eyes were playing tricks on him. He had never seen such a domineering Dharma artifact before. That woman, what kind of technique did she use to be so powerful? The sword energy sealed in that sword was prepared in advance. Mo Wu saw through it and felt a chill on his back. These guys dared to come here for the kill. They were indeed well prepared. Fortunately, he did not rely on his cultivation level to fight directly. Otherwise, he would have suffered a great loss. It seemed that this battle plan was very good. It could continuously wear down their combat power and even force out some of their trump cards. It would not be too late to take them down when they had used up most of their tricks. Mo Wu looked calm, but still felt the pain when he saw so many warriors die because of this. This was something that the Mo family had spent a very long time to manage. Moreover, looking at the current situation, such losses would continue to increase and would only continue to increase. Mo Wu shrugged helplessly when he heard this explanation. Fortunately, this was tested and he did not have to suffer this loss. But looking at the power, I'm afraid they sealed their power in it. They were still fighting with the beast realm. I'm afraid they made it on the way here. There won't be much left. Mo Wu continued. As long as they could force out the opponent's trump cards, it would be much easier for him to attack later. However, whether things would go as he wished would depend on how these old guys forced them and whether they could shake the opponent. Mo Wu was quite confident about this. Most of the people here had been on the battlefield and were elites with rich experience. Mo Wu's face became more and more ugly, because when he looked at the losses, he felt very distressed. And the losses were still increasing. He did not know when it would end. If this situation continued, then even if the Mo family could kill the 3 invaders, they would most likely suffer great losses because of it. This battle had only just begun, and it was already so tragic. Moreover, this was a battle that would last for a long time. What if the opponent had more tricks up their sleeves? Looks like we have provoked someone we should not have provoked this time, Mo Wu said with a wry smile. When he received Mo Luo's information, he originally thought that he was about to make a great achievement. Who would have thought that they would be faced with such a huge problem today? They could only watch helplessly as their elites died in battle one after another, but they could only continue to raise the stakes. Compared to the possibility of dying in this battle, Mo Wu was more willing to let others die in his place. Even if many more people would die, he didn't think much of it. The other 2 dark green pythons were completely destroyed by the fiery red sword chi, as if they couldn't cause any waves at all. However, in the next moment, Xiaoyang suddenly rushed forward. His eyes were filled with shock and anger. His flaming sword chi was still unable to defend completely, so it was inevitable that there would be some gaps. He did not expect that Kuang Heng would be able to seize this opportunity. Now there was a scar on Xiaoyang's back. Even his protective Dharma artifact had a hole burned in it, and he was completely unaware of it. If it weren't for the fact that he sensed the loss of his will, he probably still wouldn't have noticed it. Kuang Heng shook his head helplessly. He originally thought that his plan was very good. He thought that he could use the advantage of the soaring cloud mountain to kill Xiaoyang without anyone noticing. Unfortunately, it didn't work. However, there was no need to rush. Since he had failed this time, he would find a second chance. You were so domineering before, but now you are so cautious. This doesn't make sense. Kwang Hung pretended to be relaxed. Against someone like that, Kwang Hung also felt that it was extremely difficult to deal with. No matter how he looked at it, it was very difficult to defeat him. However, there was nothing he could do about it. He could only do things step by step. When would there be a result? He could only wait patiently. It wasn't up to him to decide. After Xiaoyang confirmed that the gray flames on his back had been completely blown away, he said slowly, "Your strange method is indeed impossible to defend against. However, if that's the case, you will never be able to compare to Xingtian." With that, Xiaoyang's lips curled into a disdainful smile. Kwang Hung was indeed very smart. He was even more unscrupulous in order to win. Xingtian lost to you. But if I kill you, it will be enough to prove that I am stronger than Xingtian. Kwang Hung said loudly. It could be said that losing to Xingtian previously had always been a knot in Kwang Heng's heart. Now he felt that as long as he defeated Xiaoyang, he could cross this hurdle. As for what method he used, it didn't matter. What was important was to kill the opponent. Don't you think this logic is a little strange? Xiaoyang sneered. Kwang Hung didn't feel that there was anything wrong with it. One was just stronger than the other. With your mentality, you are destined to not go far. Xiaoyang smiled, hearing such a preaching. Kwang Heng's expression became more irritated. My master hasn't even taught me this. What right do you, an opponent, have to say this? This is a complete joke. Looks like you can't take it in. Speaking of which, we're opponents to begin with. Furthermore, you deserve to die here too. What's the point of me saying so much to you? As Xiaoyang said, his expression also changed. Being long-winded with Kwang Hung right now was indeed unnecessary. Immediately, the power within Xiaoyang's body surged even more endlessly. Kwang Heng's methods were also seriously too bizarre, making people unable to guard against. Hence, there was only to end the battle quickly. As long as this trouble was resolved quickly, then he naturally did not need to worry anymore. You're indeed talking a little too much. But the one who dies here today will also only be you. Kwang Hung said angrily. Right from the start, Kwang Hung did not think that he would lose. In fact, in his view, this victory was what he was determined to win, even if he suffered a loss in these few clashes. So what? This could not be decided here either. He had to lose. The general trend was still in his hands too. As long as he advanced step by step, winning was merely a matter of time. Who was still not a genius? Even if there was a disparity, he, Kwang Hung, had methods and external forces to make up for it. Under such augmentation, he was already much stronger than him. It should have been a battle without any suspense in the first place, but it dragged on for so long. It was his fault. Chapter 27:33. At this moment, Kwang Heng's mind began to plan quickly. He knew that it would not be easy for him to end this battle. Therefore, what he had to do next was to maximize his advantage and strength. Only in this way could he completely crush his opponent. Even if there was the slightest mistake, it would be difficult to achieve. The strength of his opponent had indeed exceeded Kwang Heng's expectations. The strongest opponent that Kwang Heng had encountered in the past was Xing Tian. The previous setback had indeed made him more diligent in his cultivation, and that was why he was so famous today. However, his attacks were constantly being countered by his opponent, which made him feel very uncomfortable. It was as if his efforts over the past few hundred years had been in vain. He had been like that in the past, and it seemed that he was not much different now. Was he going to lose? Kwang Heng could not accept such an outcome, and his desire for victory had almost reached a morbid stage. Therefore, he had higher expectations of himself. In an instant, the green flames around Kwang Heng's body suddenly surged, and even seemed to have turned azure. Now, Kwang Heng could no longer remain calm. and he was ready to bring out all of his abilities. As long as he could defeat his opponent, what did it matter what method he used? The obsession in his heart made it difficult for Kwang Hang to maintain a relatively calm state. However, he was still the same as before. As long as it was a power and advantage that he could use, he would not leave out the slightest bit. Xiaoyang sensed that the atmosphere changed again, and his face suddenly became much more serious. He had to admit that the opponent in front of him was indeed very difficult to deal with. If he was even slightly careless, the result would be that he would silently suffer heavy injuries or even die. The divine sword in his hand seemed to have sensed its owner's eagerness to win, and the flames on the sword burned more intensely. At the same time, there were some thunderbolts that were constantly swimming around like snakes, and the momentum was extremely terrifying. Waves of aura were constantly condensing, as if it was unstoppable. The fog that rose from Feiyun Mountain also became faster and faster, as if it was being urged, and there was a great change in it. The auras of the two people were even more at odds with each other at this moment. Those dark clouds were also constantly crashing toward Xiaoyang, as if they wanted to use this method to interrupt his accumulation of power. Xiaoyang did not take such interference seriously at all. The sword in his hand constantly released sword qi, which was enough to destroy all of the dark clouds. However, the murderous intent contained within the dark clouds needed to be carefully scrutinized, and not the slightest mistake could be tolerated. Die! Kwang Hang roared angrily and pushed his hands forward. Suddenly, countless light blue flames rushed out from his body like an ocean. The flames were like raging waves, layer after layer, and were extremely ferocious. Every time Kwang Hang's arms pushed, a wave would attack. Nirvana wave. Right now, Kwang Hung seemed to have completely lost his mind. The power in his body continued to pour out. It was as if he no longer cared about anything and only cared about squandering his power. Of course, he had the confidence to do so. He had the support of the array and the power of his fellow sect members continuously transmitted into his body. Furthermore, he had the affinity with Flying Cloud Mountain. His power now seemed to be inexhaustible, and he could squander it wantonly. Xiaoyang's brows furrowed slightly as he looked at the incoming waves. Each wave was more powerful than the previous one, and the power within was even more shocking. If he was really hit, he would probably feel as if he was in the middle of the waves. He would be constantly hit without the slightest ability to resist. However, how could Xiaoyang be defeated so easily? He was not a person who would sit and wait for death. He held the divine sword in his hand horizontally, and immediately countless spiritual power poured out. Since Kwang Hung thought that his power was endless, he might as well show him what it meant to be profound. The difference between them was so great that it was definitely not so easy to surpass. Even if you have the right time and place, the support that those external forces can give you is not as much as you think. To forge iron, one must be strong. Thunder prison, true fire kill. In the next moment, Xiaoyang directly rushed forward with the divine sword. The flames on the sword were also like the roar of a fire dragon. They surged out violently and were unparalleled. Countless strands of sword qi shot out towards the light blue wave of flames, as if trying to beat back the seemingly unstoppable momentum. At this moment, Kwang Hung was a little flustered because he felt that the power of thunder was constantly appearing around him. In the blink of an eye, the thunder that was as thick as an arm appeared out of thin air, trapping him in it like a prison. Moreover, the thunder was still shrinking, as if squeezing the last bit of space out of him. Kwang Hang's actions did not end there. There were still many light blue flames that were pushed out, but after coming into contact with the thunder, they kept exploding. The attack was no longer coherent, but this thunder prison also showed a flaw. However, Kwang Hang's only way out was to face Xiaoyang. Was this considered a way out? Then let's fight to the death. Kwang Hung said angrily. At this moment, Kwang Heng also realized that if he escaped now, his momentum would probably be cut off because of this. By then, it would not be easy to accumulate power again. Therefore, next, he would also go all out and fight to the death with the young man who was rushing over to determine the winner. At least for the current Kwang Heng, he had too many supporters behind him. No matter how he looked at it, there was no reason for him to lose. With the help of the entire Flying Cloud Mountain and several people of the same realm, he could directly crush in terms of strength. Therefore, in terms of the degree of strength, he had too much of an advantage. Although Kwang Heng did not want to win in such a way, since Xiaoyang had already put on a desperate look, he still had to give it a try. At most, he would be bombarded by the thunder from 3 sides. He felt that he could withstand it. However, under the countless attacks, it was unknown whether Xiaoyang could still survive. Since the winner could be determined quickly, there was naturally no need to continue playing. After all, a long night was fraught with problems. However, Kwang Heng did not know that Xiaoyang was thinking the same. Because the opponent's methods were too strange, Xiaoyang had no choice but to end the battle in the shortest time possible. Even if he had to pay a price, it was fine. Chapter 2734. Xiaoyang relied on the sharpness of the divine sword and the scorching flames to charge forward. It looked as if he could cut through the surging waves of flames with a single slash. He seemed unstoppable. However, after the waves were split apart, they gathered together at an extremely fast speed, as if they wanted to completely envelop Xiaoyang, causing him to be completely incinerated in this light blue sea of flames, leaving not even a corpse behind. There were also many gray flames unique to soaring clouds, mountain mixed in, making it impossible to guard against them. Xiaoyang only charged forward. He used the flames on the divine sword as his robe to block most of the attacks. At the same time, he kept prolonging his breath in an attempt to block the attacks as much as possible to prevent himself from being injured too much. Right now, Xiaoyang's expression was very resolute, as if he was already determined to fight to the death. It was as if they wouldn't stop until a victor was decided in this battle. In Xiaoyang's opinion, if he could not achieve the results that he expected, he would not take even half a step back. Moreover, the momentum was already there, so how could he be afraid? Victory could be said to be right in front of him, so he naturally had to hold on tightly. Moreover, this place was very strange, and the gray flames were impossible to guard against. Therefore, it was important to end this battle as soon as possible. Seeing Xiaoyang's brave and fierce appearance, the corner of Kwang Heng's eyes could not help but twitch subconsciously. He also felt fear. This person was simply a desperado. It was as if no matter what decision he made, it was very crazy and he did not care about the consequences at all. Could it be that you want to die together with me? Kwang Heng thought, and he immediately became ruthless. Since Xiaoyang wanted to take this path, Kwang Heng would not be polite. He felt that this was a great opportunity to kill him. He pushed his hands faster and faster, and the power in his body was released wantonly. Even the powerhouses of the same realm, who were in different places, looked pained. Facing Kwang Heng's oppression, they could not bear it for a moment. Even so, those people did not dare to move in the slightest and rashly leave the formation. Once one of them made a move, the others would probably be implicated, and they would also suffer a backlash. The final result would only be unspeakable suffering, and if it was more serious, it would even be digging their own graves. Therefore, these people could only curse Kwang Heng in their hearts countless times. This guy did not care about their lives at all. In terms of borrowing power, he could be said to be unrestrained and even crazy. In Kwang Heng's opinion, if he killed Xiaoyang before the tip of his sword could reach him, then these problems would naturally cease to exist. At that time, he wouldn't have to think so much. It was enough to use the thickest power to kill it. Why would there be a need for techniques? But in the next moment, Kwang Heng's expression changed drastically. Because Xiaoyang seemed to be unstoppable. He passed through countless layers of flames, and his sword was right in front of him. It was too late for Kwang Heng to retreat now. This was because Liu had sealed off all his escape routes. If he moved forward, his body would definitely be pierced by the divine sword. Now, Kwang Hung seemed to have no room for choice. In an instant, the tip of the divine sword directly pierced Kwang Heng's head. Suddenly, Kwang Heng's gaze became sluggish. He had never expected that this lunatic would actually send this sword over in an unbelievable way. And it even pierced through his head. Kwang Hung did not have time to think. Countless flaming sword chi exploded at this moment and kept moving. Suddenly, Kwang Heng's head was directly torn apart. Even his body was constantly shredded under the bombardment of the sword chi and lightning. He looked extremely miserable. In the next moment, Xiaoyang was suddenly shaken back. The endless waves of flames swept him into the vortex, as if they wanted to burn him directly. Kwang Hung stood there. Although he was not completely dead, yet his heart was in great pain. At the same time, he did not understand why. How could he be defeated like this? His eyeballs fell to the ground and looked at his body that was constantly being separated. His expression was also full of pain. The fire of life above his head also began to gradually dim and was about to be extinguished. As the key to this array, Kwang Heng's injuries were extremely great. A lot of the injuries were also distributed to the other Almighties. This was also the reason why Kwang Hung did not die immediately. At this moment, the other Almighties were wailing in grief. They had never expected that, even after joining forces, they would still be defeated so miserably. They had been defeated so cleanly, and their injuries were even more severe. Kwang Heng looked viciously at Xiaoyang, who was in the middle of the whirlpool. He could only hope that Xiaoyang would be burned to ashes in the midst of this tearing. Now, Xiaoyang saw that his protective Dharma artifact was constantly being burned. Even his skin had begun to burn. It was impossible for him not to panic. His sword had been able to cut Kwang Hung into pieces, so the risk he had to take was naturally very great. Now, Xiaoyang could be said to be completely unable to control himself in this sea of fire. It could be said that his life was hanging by a thread. The vortex became more and more turbulent, and Xiaoyang seemed to be unable to extricate himself. He could only go with the flow as if he could only wait for death to come. But there was nothing he could do. Naturally, Xiaoyang wouldn't just sit there and wait for his death. The power in his body was also constantly leaking out, trying to shake out a way for himself to survive. However, it was not an easy task to achieve this goal. Because of the serious injuries, Xiaoyang could only continue to grit his teeth and persevere. No matter how unwilling he was in his heart, he could only do so. Fortunately, Xiaoyang's cultivation was relatively deep, so his response was more appropriate. Therefore, he was not completely swallowed by the vortex, but continued to struggle. Your struggle is meaningless. You only have a dead end. Kwang Hung roared angrily. Now that Kwang Heng's soul had been three-dimensional, he looked at his opponent with resentment, wishing that he could tear him into pieces. Now he had completely lost his mind. At the same time, Kwang Heng's soul power was very weak, and what he could control was even more limited. Otherwise, if he added more fuel to the fire now, it would be enough to directly kill the young man in the vortex. However, Xiaoyang just sneered and said, "You can't do anything to me when you're alive. Do you want to use your soul to kill people?" As soon as these words came out, Kwang Hung almost went crazy. In the face of such provocation, Kwang Hung could do nothing. However, he could continue to watch in the form of a soul. Chapter 2735. On the airship, Princess Mingzhu was no longer standing on it. Instead, she was suspended in the air. The airship did not continue to move forward. It stopped where it was. Even though he had achieved his goal, Mo Wei felt very uncomfortable. In order to stop the other party, he had lost 3 rank 5 experts. Such an outcome made him feel very pained. As for the core members of the martial emperor realm, more than half of them were lost. This woman is really powerful. Her means are beyond our reach. As Mo Wei spoke, The smile on his face became much more helpless. He had never thought that the result would be like this. But fortunately, such a sacrifice was worth it. This was because the woman was beginning to show signs of exhaustion after going through a series of battles. Moreover, the power she was displaying now was weaker than before. Of course, she also had many injuries on her body. That was the good news. Although the price they paid was a little high, at least it was worth it. It could pave the way for the subsequent killing. However, Mo Wei was not so optimistic. He knew very well that the man standing at the bow of the airship still had not made a move. It was as if this battle had nothing to do with him. For by Jian, the current situation was indeed like this. He only needed to watch the person in the sky. If he made a move, that was what Bai Jian wanted. However, he did not expect Mo Jiu to be so calm. He allowed the situation to change several times, but he still watched there without any intention of making a move. Therefore, it was not easy to wait for him to make a move. In this regard, Bai Jian was very helpless. In fact, Bai Jian also considered taking the initiative to fight with Mo Jiu. However, he did not dare to act rashly. If Mo Jiu still had some tricks up his sleeve, then the three of them would be separated and it would be difficult for them to help each other. It would be terrible if they were defeated one by one. Therefore, as he watched the situation deteriorate, Bai Jian had to endure the agitation in his heart and continue to watch. He was the last person standing, so he naturally had to deal with all kinds of unexpected situations that might occur. If he acted rashly, it would trigger a chain reaction that could easily cause a collapse. Currently, the situation in Soaring Cloud Mountain was still unknown. Hence, even though Bai Jian had many ideas, he could only temporarily put them aside. In fact, Bai Jian had thought of asking his patriarch and the divine emperor to help. But with Xiao Yang not taking action, it would not be easy for them to reach the battlefield quickly. Even without their support, Bai Jian was naturally not afraid. He did not rely on them much. In fact, when he decided to come here, he had already disregarded his life and death. It was just that he felt that he would not be able to last for long if this continued. That was why he had such thoughts. If it was a face-to-face battle, even if he was facing an opponent stronger than him, Bai Jian would not be the slightest bit afraid. However, he was still not used to this kind of battle formation. It was very uncomfortable. However, he had no choice but to do so. The bigger picture was more important. Princess Mingzhu was still constantly using her divine ability. As long as someone dared to approach, they would definitely die under her sword. Moreover, these guys didn't seem to be afraid at all. Each and every one of them charged forward without any regard for their own lives, only to lose their lives. Princess Mingzhu was also aware of this point, but she could only fall into this endless cycle. The elixirs that she had taken to replenish her spiritual power now seemed to be of little use and were very slow. Although Princess Mingzhu's attacks were still as domineering as before, her strength was lighter and her momentum was weaker. Brother Kuang Wei, it seems that today is the day for the two of us to make a contribution, Moa said with a smile. After observing for a long time, Moa felt that the time was ripe. It was time to take the woman's life. That woman was indeed powerful. With her own strength, using the many magical functions of the airship and some magic weapons, she had killed 3 of their 5th-order powerhouses and countless others. They had already lost 2/3 of all the elites they had brought. Such a heavy loss, but it was only enough to kill one of the enemy's people. Although this lesson was very painful, in Moa's view it was very worth it. To obtain the final victory, some sacrifices were always needed. Kuang Wei stood to the side, but he wasn't as optimistic as he said. That Bai Jian hasn't made a move yet. Bai Jian killed the Sun brothers with his own strength. No matter how one looked at it, this strength couldn't be weaker than that woman. If he didn't make a move, it would be a hidden danger in the end. If they rushed forward rashly, they might be caught off guard. Moa sneered and said, "If that guy could make a move, how could he watch his companions fall into a siege and be injured several times without making a move?" Hearing this, Kwong Wei frowned slightly. There was indeed a problem with this. All of a sudden, Kwong Wei's eyes flashed with a hint of surprise. Since the three of them came to the Inflame world together, it was naturally impossible for there to be a situation of discord. Then Bai Jian didn't make a move to rescue them. It was entirely because he couldn't make a move. Although the Mo family had arranged most of their elites in Flying Cloud Mountain, there were still some forces that were not completely exposed. It was probably those forces that made the jade-faced youth not dare to act rashly. Once he made a move, the people who were watching in the dark would also make a move. However, Kwong Wei still felt a little unlucky. The other party did make a move, but many of the Mo family's powerhouses were involved. This was really a little ironic. But today he had seen many tragic situations, so Kwong Wei didn't think too much. As long as he could save his own life in this battle, it was already very difficult. What shame, reputation. What was the point of thinking so much? If a person died, it was useless to think too much. Okay. Kwong Wei responded and rushed directly to the woman. Now Kwong Wei's expression was also very excited. He felt that if he could take down this woman, he would be the first contributor in this battle. Seeing Kwong Wei take the lead, Moa showed a sly smile. Because in his view, although the woman was already an arrow at the end of its flight, she probably still had some power left. Since Kwong Wei's charge was so powerful, he could just let him be the horse's pawn and test his strength first. And he, Moa, only needed to follow behind and see the situation clearly, then slowly collect all the benefits left by this battle. Chapter 27:36. Mo Jiu, who was standing in the air, looked a little helpless. He had seen several opportunities to attack, but he was unable to do so. This was because no matter what happened, the jade-faced man's attention had always been on him. As such, no matter how anxious Mo Jiu was, he did not dare to act rashly, since he had already set up such a formation. He was certain that his opponents all had the ability to contend with him. As such, unless there was a great opportunity, he would not act rashly. Mo Wu's mood became a lot gloomier because of this. After seeing too many of his companions die, he began to feel a little numb. It was a tactic that was akin to throwing away one's life. However, looking at it now, the effect was very small. However, it was not like they did not gain anything. They had a rough idea of Xiaoyang and Princess Mingzhu's abilities. They were clear about their specific strength and could come up with a rough plan to deal with them. However, because the jade-faced man with the sword did not act, they still could not come up with a specific battle plan. This was what made them feel the most helpless and troubled. They thought a lot, but it was almost impossible to put it into action. Unbelievable. The geniuses from the 3,000 small worlds are so powerful. Mo Wu shook his head helplessly. Mo Jiu smiled bitterly. They had heard about the 3,000 small worlds, and their words were filled with disdain. They felt that it was just a barren land that lacked spiritual qi and materials. However, the people who had walked out of there made him feel fearful. Those who can reach the top are naturally not simple. I am only one of the people who reach the top of this world, but they are the people who reach the top of the 3,000 small worlds, Mo Jiu said, self-deprecatingly. Thinking of this, Mo Jiu felt a little comforted and did not feel as uncomfortable as before. However, these thoughts were just deceiving himself. If he was afraid, he was afraid. How could there be so many reasons? Mo Wu also smiled bitterly. This was not bad, but it was also a little far-fetched. They were not as good as their opponents in such a good environment. This was the difference between them. The furious river that you will be guarding next concerns your life. Take care of yourself. Mo Jiu shook his head and said. Originally, Mo Jiu thought that he would be able to see a lot of things in the first round. He even thought that he would be able to decide the outcome of the battle if he suddenly made a move. However, who would have thought that the other party would be so cautious and not give him any chance to poke at him? Furthermore, he was unable to figure out the other party's background. Mo Wu frowned. He didn't understand. What did that mean? There's no need to look anymore. Moa and Kuang Wei will only die if they go, as long as I don't take action. Bai Jian similarly won't either. Mo Ju said, helplessly. Mo Wu frowned and shook his head when he heard this. He felt that these words were a little overboard. However, since the patriarch was a Tier 6 powerhouse and was experienced and knowledgeable, it was naturally not impossible for him to directly announce the outcome of the battle. However, he felt that the woman was already an arrow at the end of its flight. If Bai Jian did not make a move, then the outcome of the battle was still unknown. But in the next moment, Mo Wu frowned. That was because he saw a golden sword gleam fall. Kuang Wei was severely injured and could not continue. That woman appeared to be fighting like a cornered beast. However, every single one of her attacks was extremely powerful, making it difficult for those of the same cultivation level as her to resist. Looking at such a loss, Mo Wu frowned again. At the same time, he began to plan again in his heart. Sometimes the ability of a cornered beast should not be underestimated. Forcing her into a desperate situation step by step, one also needed to be cautious. If one was not careful, one might be dragged into the abyss. Mo Wu was not in a hurry to leave. He wanted to see the last moment. Only in this way could he learn the most. In soaring Cloud Mountain, the gray fog that was slowly rising from the ground also began to thin out. Xiaoyang had also escaped from the whirlpool, but the skin on his body was more or less burnt, and he looked like he was in a terrible state. The most serious injury was on his left leg. One could even see the eerie white bone. It was extremely terrifying. However, Xiaoyang's expression did not change. This was because he did not feel the slightest pain. He looked as if he was standing there numbly, looking at the young man who did not turn into ashes in the flame vortex. Kuang Heng gnashed his teeth in anger. However, there was nothing he could do. He could only watch. How is this possible? How is this possible? Kuang Heng kept repeating in his heart. He did not dare to believe this result. The flame vortex finally exploded under the violent power. Xiaoyang also tried his best to protect himself. However, he still looked extremely miserable. Xiaoyang looked coldly at the white bone. The smile on his face was very helpless. However, with his current appearance, this smile looked very strange. I said that you were not as good as Xingtian, but you didn't believe me, Xiaoyang said as he took out a bottle of elixir and swallowed it. When he said this, Kuang Heng was very angry. After swallowing the elixir, Xiaoyang suddenly cried out in pain. The pain was so overwhelming that he almost fainted. For a moment he was drenched in sweat. You were just lucky, Kuang Heng said through gritted teeth. Xiaoyang just smiled and shrugged. Then he took out another bottle. Sitting on the ground, he began to pour the medicinal powder on his missing skin. When the medicinal powder touched his flesh, blood immediately gushed out like a fountain. Xiaoyang grimaced in pain. Seeing Xiaoyang constantly asking for trouble, Kuang Heng was very puzzled. Soon, Kuang Heng saw some gray mist being forced out by the medicinal powder. His eyes were filled with shock. His flesh was recovering at a speed visible to the naked eye. However, Xiaoyang's face became even paler. The blood and qi that he lost could not be easily replenished with elixirs. This fire poison is indeed unusual. I really can't absorb it in such a short time. However, it doesn't matter. I will slowly study it when I have time in the future, Xiaoyang said with a smile. Kuang Heng subconsciously took a few steps back. He felt fear. This person even knew about the fire poison and wanted to study it. How much ability did he have? How much did he know? Under such pain, he was still able to talk and laugh humorously, with a fake smile on his face. In the next moment, a sword light flashed. Under the sword qi, Kuang Heng's consciousness was completely destroyed. After completely wiping out Kuang Heng's divine sense, Xiaoyang quickly wandered around the flying Cloud Mountain. He found all the martial emperors who were still alive because of the backlash and rewarded them with a sword strike. Chapter 27:37. Now that these martial kings were heavily injured and unable to move, it was a good time to easily kill them. In less than the time it took to brew a cup of tea, all the martial king experts on Flying Cloud Mountain had died at the hands of Xiaoyang. Without these formation cores, the great formation on Flying Cloud Mountain naturally collapsed. Immediately, the gray fog surged out again, and clouds enveloped the mountain. The gray fog that made it hard for people to see clearly also gradually disappeared. Flying Cloud Mountain also gradually revealed its true appearance. When Bai Jian saw the desolate mountain, the corner of his mouth twitched subconsciously. He had never thought that it would be like this. It had indeed caught him off guard. As for what he had seen earlier, it was just a man-made illusion. The mountains of the Inflame world had always been desolate. At a glance, they were almost all desolate. It was extremely difficult to see a trace of green. This was also the characteristic of the Inflame world. It was extremely difficult to find some spiritual items here. It was also because of this lack that the Inflame world became warlike. They had no choice but to expand and enslave a few more worlds in order to increase their strength. Right now, Bai Jian was also very calm. Since the great enemy in the sky had already left, then he naturally didn't need to worry too much. After all, this matter could already be announced as coming to an end. In the Battle of Flying Cloud Mountain, they had obtained a complete victory. Furthermore, they had also concealed Bai Jian's strength, making it difficult for the opponent to target them. As for Mo Wei, he felt that the woman's strength had already been exhausted. It was a great opportunity to take advantage of her, but in the end he had lost his life and died with hatred in his heart. Those low-level martial kings and King Wu's elites, who had not died in battle, looked at each other in dismay. With the death of the supreme expert, they knew that if they continued to fight, they would only be sending themselves to their deaths. Previously, under their orders, they could charge forward without hesitation and even pay with their lives. That was because they could see a glimmer of hope and felt that victory was within their grasp. However, after all the stage 5 martial kings had died in battle, their mentality had undergone a very subtle change. This was because they felt that if there was no supreme expert leading them, they would be sending themselves to their deaths in a meaningless manner. It was useless. Once such a thought appeared in their minds, their morale quickly collapsed. They also knew very well that if they continued to be in a stalemate, it would be meaningless. If he could live, why would he send himself to death? They weren't afraid of death, but it had to be meaningful. The first person began to retreat. It was like the cracks that appeared before an avalanche, and it was getting faster and faster. Not long after, the remaining elites were defeated like a collapsing mountain. They began to scatter in all directions, and the speed at which they fled was even more impressive. Princess Mingzhu only looked on coldly and did not pursue. Instead, she turned around and returned to the airship. If he wanted to exterminate all of them, that was naturally feasible. However, it was an extremely huge project, and it was not something that could be completed so easily. Moreover, it would take a lot of effort. With the war before them, every move would need to be calculated carefully. How could they possibly do that kind of thing? The smile on Bai Jian's face deepened as he looked at the army that was fleeing in all directions. The 3 of them were well aware that following the defeat of Soaring Cloud Mountain, the morale of the Mo family's forces would plummet. In turn, it would affect the Inflame realm and even shake it. When that time came, the Inflame realm would really fall into a state of panic. Once the morale of a world was suppressed, it would be a very terrifying thing. However, this was also good. If they could frighten the courage of the entire Inflame realm, their following actions would be much easier. Even the obstruction they would face would be greatly reduced. If they could obtain unexpected gains from this battle, it would be something they could not wish for more. Sometimes, in a situation where both sides were evenly matched, the strength of the morale would also determine the direction of the war to a large extent. These were all common occurrences. Although Bai Jian did not think too much about it, he still felt that no matter what it was worth a try. However, what kind of changes would happen to the Yin Flame realm next would depend on their mental endurance, or whether someone could stand up and turn the tide. They had done everything they could, but the final outcome was still uncertain. Immediately, Bai Jian also saw Xiaoyang. Xiaoyang was floating in the air, standing on soaring Cloud Mountain. His hands were constantly forming seals, and a picture rapidly expanded and slowly descended. This guy is really taking advantage of every opportunity. He wants to refine soaring Cloud Mountain and keep it for himself. Bai Jian smiled bitterly. This style was a little too much. However, it was satisfying. Since the Yin Flame realm likes to invade other worlds so much, then I'll let you feel how it would feel to have a piece of your world taken away. Such an action could be said to be extremely crazy. Princess Mingzhu took a few glances and said, "This soaring Cloud Mountain has many strange things. It's so tall that it reaches the clouds. If the refinement goes smoothly, it might be comparable to a high-grade spiritual weapon." As soon as these words came out, Bai Jian could not help but suck in a breath of cold air. If that was the case, then this soaring Cloud Mountain was indeed worth refining. However, to do such a thing in someone else's territory, wasn't it a little too arrogant? Fortunately, after the previous battle, the other party did not seem to have the intention to continue fighting, which made him feel slightly relieved. Now, several powerful figures from the Mo family were watching from afar, and their eyes were about to spit fire. They all felt that this outsider was too arrogant to want to keep soaring Cloud Mountain. Wasn't this a little too wishful thinking? The more they thought about it, the more resentful they felt. However, they could only watch helplessly. In the end, they could not do anything. The death of Quan Hung and Mo Wei in battle made them completely calm down. If they did not listen to orders and charged over, they would just be throwing away their lives in vain. It would be useless. In this regard, these powerful figures were very clear in their hearts. They could only endure and continue to fight according to the original plan. Perhaps they could only rely on the advantage of time and place to be able to fight against him. If they really set up a big formation in front of the two armies, once the battle started, they would probably suffer more losses and even suffer a crushing defeat. That was all possible. At the same time, many powerful figures could not stand it. Their Yin Flame realm and the powerful Wanqiu realm had never suffered such humiliation. But now they were suppressed by 3 people. Chapter 2738. Xiao Yang channeled all of his spiritual power into the stately painting as he channeled the spell. Soaring Cloud Mountain was so big and of such a high grade. Refining it would definitely not be an easy task. Fortunately, he had the help of the mountain river map, which could save him a lot of effort. Otherwise, at such a juncture, without the help of a magic tool, it would be extremely difficult to refine it by himself. If the other party saw any clues and launched a surprise attack, their apparent advantage would become a disadvantage in an instant. As for now, Princess Mingzhu had scared the army away. Even if a mighty figure suddenly made a move, they could stop it. Moreover, Bai Jian looked sloppy, but his mind did not move away from Xiaoyang at all. No one knew what kind of reaction the Mo family would have. Therefore, it was never a good idea to be cautious. The more they won the battle, the more they needed to calmly look at and respond. Arrogant soldiers were bound to lose because they underestimated the opponent and did not take enough precautions. If the opponent seized the opportunity and broke through, they would naturally not be able to stop it. Of course, the 3 of them had great trust in each other, so no matter what they did, they were very confident. Suddenly, the flying Cloud Mountain also shook violently. It was obviously attracted by the mountain river map and began to struggle. This was also a confrontation between the Yin Flame realm and the mountain river map. A piece of land could be shattered, but if it was taken away by the other party, it would be a bit wrong. As the soaring Cloud Mountain shook, everything within a radius of 1,000 miles began to tremble. Even the raging river began to shake. The river water was turbulent like waves, rolling endlessly. Some of the surrounding buildings began to crumble under the impact of the tremors. Such a drastic change caused the fleeing cultivators to feel as if their guts were about to burst. These guys were truly monsters. It seemed that no matter what they did, it was hard to accept. This also caused those cultivators to have no choice but to try to figure out just how powerful those three people were to be able to be so confident. Along the way, he was like a hot knife through butter as he arrived at this place without a hitch. Now, they even wanted to flatten the soaring cloud mountain that had existed since ancient times. It could be said that when the surrounding cultivators saw Xiaoyang refining the soaring cloud mountain, they were filled with anger and wanted nothing more than to charge forward and risk their lives. But at the same time, they were also afraid. They knew very well that if they really charged out, they would only end up asking for trouble and giving up their lives for nothing. It was meaningless, looking at it and stopping, nothing more than this. Good fellow, are you afraid that the commotion isn't big enough? Bai Jian muttered in a mocking tone. Princess Mingzhu had already consumed a few pills to recover her spiritual power and injuries. From time to time, she would check on Xiaoyang's condition. After all, the place they were at seemed calm, yet undercurrents were surging, so they had to be on guard at all times. Even the slightest change in the current situation could have a great impact. If they missed it, no one could say what the consequences would be. This soaring cloud mountain is indeed not bad. Xiaoyang's foresight is even better. Princess Mingzhu sighed emotionally. Suddenly, Princess Mingzhu seemed to understand why Xiaoyang was able to grow from the barren, flowing cloud world. From the abilities and habits he displayed right now, she could see some clues. Putting aside Xiaoyang's abilities and foresight in a situation where resources were scarce, he was able to use his sharp eyes to gather all the beneficial resources for himself and grow rapidly. The soaring cloud mountain could rival a high-grade spiritual artifact when it was refined into a magic artifact. So Xiaoyang directly took action without any hesitation. He was decisive and decisive. He would not drag things out. Bai Jian nodded with a smile. Xiaoyang had never disappointed him in this aspect. Back then, when they worked together to kill the violent ape, Xiaoyang directly gave the skeleton to him and made it into a protective magic artifact. It was very useful. Sometimes the grade of a magic artifact was not necessarily better. Instead, it was more important that it was suitable. If he gave Bai Jian more swords, if they were not the best, they would not be of much help to him. I'm also convinced. The Mo family was so aggressive before, but now they're playing dead. They don't even dare to breathe loudly. They just watched as he uprooted the soaring cloud mountain, Bai Jian said helplessly. Princess Mingzhu was currently recuperating, while Xiaoyang was busy subduing the soaring cloud mountain. If the other party were to take action, only Bai Jian would be able to deal with them. Just now, the two of them were killing happily. As a spectator, Bai Jian could not help but feel a little bored. However, there was nothing he could do. He had different responsibilities. Right now, if the other party dared to take action, Bai Jian could use his flying sword to charge in and fight with them. Right now, they're like birds that are startled by the twang of a bow. Naturally, they don't dare to fight. I'm afraid that the defensive line behind is the most important part. It's hard to break through. Princess Mingzhu shook her head and said, a soaring cloud mountain had already forced them to the brink of death. In the next checkpoint, the Mo family would probably stake everything on a single throw. If they wanted to completely crush the Mo family, the next battle would be the most important thing. It could even be said that the next battle would determine whether their counterattack on the In-Flame world would go smoothly or not. Right now, Princess Mingzhu began to think. The next battle was the most important part. Perhaps the other party would put all their forces into it. Therefore, how to fight the next battle naturally became a problem that had to be solved. Of course, according to Princess Mingzhu's thoughts, it was time to invite her father and Swordmaster Li, who were in the flowing cloud world. If they were to assist, any one of them would be able to hold the line and attack with full force. They would definitely not be able to withstand it. Li Fengmu and the God Emperor had been waiting in the flowing cloud world for a long time. However, they still did not see the formation open. They could not help but feel anxious. This was because they only knew that the battle had already begun. However, they still did not know the specific situation. As for the safety of the three of them, it was a problem that the two old men were extremely concerned about. The three of them would determine the future status of the Four Realms Alliance. If anything happened to them, it would definitely be a heavy loss for them. Suddenly, the jade pendant in the God Emperor's hand shone with light. After reading the information within, the God Emperor revealed a very pleased smile. He was very pleased. Chapter 2739. Look at your smile. They must have won a great victory over there. Li Fengmu said and also laughed loudly. As long as the situation there was optimistic, it was enough. The Divine Emperor nodded. The Mo family used Soaring Cloud Mountain as their first line of defense, but it has been completely breached. All of their fifth-order experts have died in battle. Now, Xiaoyang is even preparing to refine Soaring Cloud Mountain into his own weapon. These words made the old swordmaster Li gasp. He never thought that the young man would be so arrogant. Soaring Cloud Mountain was adjacent to Fury Flame. It was completely under the enemy's nose. So, it was really hard to judge with common sense. However, this method still made people feel relieved. After all, when the Yin Flame world invaded, the Four Realm Alliance also had their mountains and rivers shattered, and blood flowed like rivers. It was time for the culprits to have a taste of their own medicine. Then when should we go over? Li Fengmu asked with a smile. Now, Li Fengmu felt his blood boiling. If they went over now with their ability, it was enough to turn the entire Yin Flame world upside down. They might even make them pay with blood. Their overall strength was not enough. Otherwise, Li Fengmu would lead the army and let the Yin Flame world know what it was like to plunge people into misery and suffering. The Divine Emperor shook his head. It still depends on Xiaoyang's plan. However, we still have to be careful. After all, we have to guard against the actions of the Wanshou realm's Xingtian. Li Fengmu frowned slightly. If the Yin Flame world took drastic measures, then Xiaoyang and the others who were far away might be thrown into chaos. Therefore, the two of them could also avoid a lot of trouble by staying here. They would not be completely caught in a dilemma. However, Li Fengmu's heart still did not feel good. These three little guys were the ones who had contributed to the turmoil these few times, and there was nothing they could do. It looked like they were guarding, but in such a calm situation, what was the point of guarding? Sword Masterly, please don't be impatient. Moreover, we are the hidden aces. How can we make a move unless we are truly at our wits' end? If all of us were to make a move, how dangerous would the situation be? The God Emperor said with a smile. He said those words so casually, as if he didn't take it to heart. Li Fengmu frowned and didn't say anything. He had naturally imagined such a situation. However, he didn't want to see that happen again. Last time, the Four Realms Alliance had suffered heavy losses. Even in the Sword Heart world, the number of martial emperors who died could be counted on one hand. If he were to do it again, perhaps even his old bones would die. Li Fengmu also remained silent. Facing such a situation, there was really nothing he could do but wait like this. Withdraw! With Xiaoyang's roar, the mountain river map immediately displayed a strong power and sucked the Soaring Cloud Mountain into it. After the Soaring Cloud Mountain was uprooted, there was a large open space there. It looked extremely empty. Without the cover of the Soaring Cloud Mountain, the raging flame was completely seen by them. They could even see the Mo family's courtyard behind it clearly. Bai Jian was dumbfounded. He originally thought that Xiaoyang's chances of success were not high, but he did it. This was enough to make people feel a little incredulous. This guy was really able to do things that ordinary people couldn't hope to do. After the Soaring Cloud Mountain was sucked into the map, there was an additional mountain pattern on it. Xiaoyang smiled with satisfaction. He wanted to study the fire poison hidden in the Soaring Cloud Mountain. Although he didn't have time now, he could slowly study it when he had time in the future. Immediately, Xiao Yang glanced at the somewhat turbulent, raging flame river and turned back to the airship. "You're really a fierce person. You can even do this." Bai Jian gave him a thumbs up and said with admiration. Xiao Yang just smiled indifferently and kept the mountain river map with satisfaction. "It's been hard on you." Looking at Bai Jian's depressed look, Xiao Yang knew that it was hard for him to suppress himself during this period of time. If he let Bai Jian charge and break through the enemy lines, even if he ended up covered in scars, he would probably feel nothing. Suppressing himself like this was a huge test of his nature. The facts proved that Bai Jian was no longer as frivolous as before. No matter how uncomfortable he was, he could endure it and not take action. He watched the Almighty who was hiding in the sky so that he didn't have a chance to take action. "What's next?" Bai Jian asked with a smile. If they won the battle at the soaring cloud mountain, they could continue to advance triumphantly and kill their opponents until they threw away their helmets and armor. However, this was only a thought. If he really wanted to do it, it would be very difficult. Xiao Yang and Princess Mingzhu naturally needed time to recuperate after such a huge battle. "Don't be anxious. Let's see what our opponents have to say first." Xiao Yang smiled. Immediately, Xiao Yang sat down. After swallowing a few bottles of elixirs, he directly entered a meditative state. "All right, who asked you to work hard? I'll continue to be on guard and keep an eye on those rascals." Bai Jian said. The previous battle exhausted Princess Mingzhu and Xiao Yang greatly. Moreover, they were injured. If they rashly continued to advance, it would be difficult for them to face the battle in their best condition. Therefore, it was important for them to recover their condition now. The better their condition was, the higher their chances of success would be. Behind the furious river, Mo Gio stood with his hands behind his back. Looking at the flying ship suspended in midair, he frowned subconsciously. The flying ship didn't continue to advance. Xiao Yang probably exhausted a lot of energy because he had subdued the soaring cloud mountain. It could even be said that the current him had less than 1/10 of his energy left. In that case, it was a great opportunity to take advantage of the situation. Although Bai Jian had yet to take action, the strength that the other two could unleash was probably not much. However, Mo Gio wasn't in a hurry to take action because he felt that the situation wasn't right. From some information he obtained from the Myriad Beast realm, he knew that Xiao Yang was a very cautious person. Back then, when his realm was not high enough, he secretly acted and plotted. It could be said that it was extremely ingenious and caused the Myriad Beast realm to suffer a lot. Now, he looked like he was exhausted, but he was swaggering there to recover. Obviously, he directly displayed his weak side in front of him. It was as if he was telling him that there was only one chance. If he missed it, there wouldn't be another chance. Would such a cautious person purposely reveal his weakness? Could the so-called weakness be a trap? Chapter 2740. Now, Mo Gio was not sure about the specific situation, but he was very clear that according to the information he had obtained, Xiao Yang could not have made such a big mistake. Therefore, this was probably done on purpose. He looked at Bai Jian again. He seemed to be standing there carelessly, but his hand had never moved from the hilt of his sword. From this, it could be seen that he had never let his guard down. Mo Gio was a little annoyed. He rubbed his temples and felt that the division of labor between the three young people was too clear. Moreover, it was so well connected that he could not find any flaws. Previously, Mo Gio did not think much of it, but now he realized that these three young people were extremely difficult to deal with. When he thought of the rumors that had appeared to help them build momentum, it could be said that they were well connected and had been planning for a long time. To be able to make such an exquisite arrangement, how could he possibly be a careless person? Perhaps every step was calculated, which was why he dared to be so presumptuous. It is true that the other party has an ambush, but it is also true that Xiao Yang does not have much strength now. Mo Wu said with some emotion. Although Mo Wu was also fearful of the three young men, he had a clear view of the situation. He knew when to make the right decision. However, he was not the person in power now, so he could only listen to others. No matter how unhappy he was in his heart, he could only endure it. After all, everyone's vision and thoughts were different. What they could see was naturally very different from what they had seen. Mo Jio's expression became a little uncertain because of this sentence. He suddenly glared at Mo Wu. He had not helped him to the position, and now he was teaching him how to do things. Wasn't this kind of thinking and action a little bold and presumptuous? Moreover, Mo Jio had already analyzed the gains and losses in his heart. Even if there were some mistakes, it would not be too big. Everything has to be done carefully. Otherwise, if you are not careful, you will fall into a bottomless abyss and never be reincarnated. Mo Jio said earnestly. Hearing this, Mo Wu's expression became a lot uglier. How could he not understand such an obvious threat? However, if he was not willing to take the risk, it would be impossible for him to reap any rewards. In fact, he might even miss this great opportunity. Such behavior, indeed, made people feel aggrieved. It had always been the case that a general success was built on thousands of bones. Mo could only shake his head and sigh. Since the patriarch had already made up his mind, it would not be good for him to say anything more. After all, the entire Mo family was under his command, and there was no second voice. Even if Mo Jio's plan was wrong, they could only move forward bravely and could not question it. Once there were doubts and superfluous voices, people's hearts would change, and they would not be able to unite. In the end, all of the power would be scattered, and that would be the most terrifying thing. When Mo Wu thought about this, he could only sigh silently. There was nothing he could do about it. He only hoped that this kind of stability would bring them enough benefits. Or perhaps they could minimize the losses to the minimum. Otherwise, if he missed this great opportunity, it might not appear again in the future. Master, you're being a little too cautious now. Mo Wu thought for a long time. He couldn't help but speak his mind. When Mo Jio heard this, he frowned, and the atmosphere around him suddenly changed. He was very nervous. Sensing the change in the atmosphere, the pressure in Mo Wu's heart suddenly increased by a lot. It was possible that this temperamental patriarch would suddenly kill someone. Even if he needed people now, he would not show the slightest mercy. It wasn't easy to establish a foothold in the Mo family's power. Previously, Meng Hu was isolated. In the end, he could only send himself to his death. He did not even dare to think about betraying them. He did not even dare to escape. Why? It was because of the patriarch's style, which made every powerful person feel a lingering fear. Of course, if one wanted to completely break free from the patriarch's control, it would be possible only if one was stronger than him. And Mo Wu was not afraid at all. Since he had already said such words, why should he be afraid? If he really wanted to kill someone, even if Mo Wu was afraid, what could it change? Therefore, it was better to be tough and face such a situation calmly. Perhaps there would be a good end for him. Mo Jiu suddenly laughed. He patted Mo Wu on the shoulder and said, "Boy, you're right. It seems that I made the right choice to let you guard the furious river." Mo Wu also laughed, but looking at the somewhat uncertain smile, he could not help but feel a little scared. A fake smile was the most terrifying. It seemed that no one had been able to understand the thoughts of this family head all this time. Perform well, and try to sink those 3 guys into the furious river. In this way, your reputation will soar. When the time comes, it will be justifiable for me to delegate power to you. Mo Jiu laughed. To delegate power, Mo Jiu only needed to say a few words. Even if he supported a puppet, he only needed to say a few more words, and those powerful people would have to listen to him obediently even if they were dissatisfied. Mo Wu nodded with a smile but did not speak. Mo Wu still couldn't figure out what the head of the family was scheming. Therefore, he could only take one step at a time. Anyway, his life and death were no longer up to him. So why should he think too much? Even if Mo Wu wanted to escape at the last minute, He would not dare to return after this matter had calmed down. Not to mention that they were all from the same sect. Given Emojio's methods, he would have made arrangements for his relatives before he was defeated. It could be said that Emojio's methods were endless, and he had done many outrageous things. It was also because of this that those who had attached themselves to the Emo family, even if they had cultivated to the 5th level, did not dare to go out and set up their own sect. This was a huge vortex. It was easy to join, but to walk out one would have to pay a high price. Emo Wu was now in the center of the vortex and had long been unable to control himself. He could only go with the flow of this general trend, and it was difficult for him to control himself. Go! I will personally hold the line for you. I will certainly sink those 3 arrogant people into the furious river. Emo Ju patted Emo Wu on the shoulder and said with a smile. Looking at such a smile, Emo Wu felt even more guilty. He had a feeling that the furious river ahead had become a burial ground for him. Even if he was afraid, Emo Wu could not disobey the order and could only brace himself and move forward. Chapter 2741. In fact, Emo Wu also knew that the furious river was the last line of defense. Furthermore, all the elites were stationed here. If this place were to be breached, the so-called Emo family's courtyard would also fall into the enemy's hands. It would be useless. Once all the powerful figures were killed, Emojio would eventually become a commander without an army. No matter how well he understood the situation, it would be difficult for him to turn the tide. It could be said that this furious river line of defense had become Emojio's bottom line. In this regard, Emo Wu was still quite confident. When the time came, as long as he could create an opportunity for the family head, Emojio would not hesitate to take action. Thinking of this, Mo Wu felt a lot better. At the same time, there was another possibility. Once the furious river line of defense was breached, the family head might see that the situation was not good and immediately flee. Many of the powerful figures of the Emo family had died, leaving him as a commander without an army. It would be difficult for him to shoulder the burden. Therefore, when the time came, it was very likely that he would directly leave this troublesome place. With Emojio's eccentric character, what would he not do? Looking at the somewhat turbulent river, Emo Wu felt unbearable pain in his heart. This matter was difficult to deal with. The arrow was already knocked on the bow and had to be released. No matter how unwilling Emo Wu was, he could only force himself to accept whatever the outcome was. At the same time, Emo Wu was also very clear that after this incident, even if the Emo family's forces were not destroyed, they would probably only exist in name. The other 2 forces would probably begin to gradually encroach on the Emo family's territory. These things needed to be considered in the future. If he could not get through the current predicament, it would be useless no matter how much he thought about it. After a long time on the flying ship, Princess Mingzhu was the first to recover her strength. She stared at the furious river in front of her, which seemed to have calmed down and frowned slightly. The water of the furious river in front of her was dim, and she could not see clearly what was going on. There were pitifully few powerful figures stationed in the surrounding areas. As for those who were of a lower realm, they were almost nowhere to be seen. Previously, Xiaoyang had said that the furious river was very dangerous. However, no matter how she looked at it now, she could not see any signs of danger. Bai Jian also stood up, no longer concentrating as fully as before. Now he and Princess Mingzhu could deal with most of the trouble. Without the cover of the flying cloud mountain, the furious river and the Emo family's courtyard only look mediocre. Princess Mingzhu laughed. It could be said that Flying Cloud Mountain was the entrance to the Emo family's courtyard. However, the door had been taken away by Xiaoyang while he was still alive. Bai Jian nodded with a smile and said, after Soaring Cloud Mountain was uprooted, the flow of spirit qi within a radius of several thousand miles underwent a huge change. The following battle is very advantageous to us. Within a radius of 1,000 miles, the spiritual qi became chaotic. Even the heavens and the earth were repelling each other. It was not very harmonious. Under such circumstances, it would not be easy for those martial emperors to borrow the power of heaven and earth. In fact, the situation they would encounter would become even more severe. Princess Mingzhu smiled without saying anything. Even now, they still couldn't borrow the power of the world in the Inflame world. This had always been their weakness. Otherwise, why would there be so much trouble if the three of them joined forces? Soaring Cloud Mountain would have been taken down long ago. They might even have killed their way across the furious river and were about to flatten the Mo family's courtyard. However, these were just thoughts. In reality, they had to take every step carefully. They even had to repeatedly evaluate every action. Bai Jian leaned on the railing and looked a little listless. Previously, Xiaoyang deliberately sat there to recuperate. He wanted to give the Mo family's forces an illusion that they did not have much strength left and could gather to annihilate them. Unfortunately, the other party did not fall for it. Fighting in this place, where Soaring Cloud Mountain was uprooted, was much easier than fighting on the furious river. Moreover, if the family had joined in and found a chance to kill him, then this battle with the Mo family's forces would come to an end even faster. There was a huge risk in doing so, but the rewards were also very high. However, it was a pity that the other party was too cautious, so this huge gamble could not be carried out. That furious river is indeed a little strange. My divine sense can't penetrate it to see clearly. Princess Mingzhu suddenly frowned and said, "As the saying goes, only by knowing yourself and your enemy can you win 100 battles." Moreover, Xiaoyang had said many times before that the furious river would probably be the place of the final battle. Based on this information, one could conclude that this place was indeed extraordinary. Until now, they could not find out the truth. This was even more enough to show that there was a big problem inside. It's nothing more than blocking soldiers with arms and water with an earth weir. Besides, with Xiaoyang worrying about this, we can just be good tools, Bai Jian said with a smile. From the previous battle situation, Bai Jian felt that Xiaoyang's thoughts were comprehensive. So why should he worry about it? Since Xiaoyang was able to arrange everything clearly, then he would just have to follow his instructions obediently. Moreover, one's state of mind needed to be preserved and could not be damaged too much. It would be good to use all of one's mental energy on how to kill the enemy. Princess Mingzhu just smiled helplessly. She also knew that Bai Jian was such a free and easy person. Asking him to think about these complicated things was more or less making things difficult for him. Bai Jian could advance by leaps and bounds on the path of the sword because he was pure enough. He would not have too many distracting thoughts. Only by wholeheartedly seeking the sword could he have a second attitude. Princess Mingzhu glanced back and found that Xiaoyang's aura had almost recovered, so she continued to pilot the flying ship forward. Although they did not know what was strange in the furious river, they might be able to see some clues after getting closer. Of course, they also had a choice. They could directly bypass the furious river and enter the Mo family's courtyard, which could also shake the other party's foundation. However, if they did that, their original momentum would probably be disrupted. Moreover, if they wanted to bypass the furious river, it would take a lot of time. Moreover, their goal was to brazenly attack and let the Inflame world rack their brains to deal with them. In the end, they found that the method they racked their brains to think of was useless at all. It could not slow down the momentum of their advance at all. As they suffered more and more crushing defeats, the reputation of the three of them would become more and more domineering. Such an oppressive might made them even more fearful. Chapter 2742. It was very easy to defeat the experts of a world. As long as you were strong enough, you could do it. But if you want to break the mentality of this world, it won't be easy. Furthermore, it was not as simple as fighting and killing. More schemes and methods were needed to accomplish this. The purpose of their current actions was to make the entire Inflame world fearful. Even after this trip was over, the Inflame realm would probably live in fear for a long time. Only then would they know how powerful they were. Since they chose to attack the Four Realms Alliance, they would naturally have to pay the corresponding price. This was something that had never changed since ancient times. Although it was unreasonable for these things to make some people fearful, it was also unreasonable for those innocent people to be massacred. Moreover, they were already merciful for not massacring them. Their bottom line was also here. Those in power, as well as the remaining powerful beings who were involved in this invasion, had to die. This was the attitude of the Four Realms Alliance. They could not tolerate any problems. Doing this was not only to intimidate the Flame world, but also to remind the other worlds that sometimes, when you make a move, you must accept the corresponding consequences. The Great Tao was merciless since ancient times. The speed of the flying ship was not fast. It was still within the boundary of soaring Cloud Mountain. However, when the experts stationed on the raging river saw this, they began to prepare for battle. They knew that if the other party insisted on moving forward, the next battle would be unavoidable. At the same time, many experts sighed with emotion. These three little guys were really bold. With the strength of the three of them, they wanted to challenge an entire world. Such glory could be said to be in the past. However, under such circumstances, everyone had no way out. They all had their own beliefs and could only fight. Not long after, Xiaoyang also withdrew from his cultivation and stood at the bow of the ship. Although his strength and state had not recovered to their peak, it was imperative for him to move forward. With his current condition, it would take him more than 10 days to recover to his peak. This could not be delayed. The longer they delayed, the more time the other party would have to think. Who knows, they might even lose their last breath because of this. At the same time, their opponents would look down on them and think that they were only strong at the beginning. What they needed was a tight offensive rhythm so that they couldn't catch their breath. Some cultivators are hiding in the raging river. That's why we can't find them. Xiaoyang took a glance and explained the clues clearly. Princess Mingzhu nodded. She had already guessed this before, but she was unable to confirm it. Now that Xiaoyang said this, it was certain that the other party had indeed done so. However, how to cross the raging river had become the most important issue at hand. After all, that was the Mo family's last line of defense. It could be said to be meticulously arranged, and it might even be the place where the final battle would take place. How could it be simple? This furious river and flying Cloud Mountain can be said to be of the same breadth and branch. They have many similar characteristics. Although I've already refined soaring Cloud Mountain and destroyed the feng shui here, we still can't let our guard down, even though the raging river's power will be greatly reduced, said Xiaoyang solemnly. Xiaoyang also obtained a lot of information from some people's divine senses. However, it was a little vague about the raging river. He only had a rough idea. Back then, a mighty figure from the beast realm went deep into the raging river alone. It could be said that it was a flat land, but he was buried in the raging river in the end. That mighty figure's cultivation was extraordinary back then. When he commanded the world, Xian Jian of the Jiao Dragon tribe had only just started cultivating. It could be seen how strange the raging river was. If the situation is critical, we won't let go. We'll take out all our trump cards and throw them in to blow up the raging river, Princess Mingzhu said with a smile. Bai Jian shrugged helplessly. He would not participate in such a battle that was like competing with his family's wealth. Bai Jian's magic tools were all flying swords. He could not be compared to Princess Mingzhu, who was very rich. This time, he had taken many good things on this expedition. Bai Jian's sword could only be used to kill people. It was a little difficult for him to break formations. Xiaoyang smiled. He felt that there was no need to go through so much trouble. After all, without flying Cloud Mountain, the raging river would become isolated. Even if it had any miraculous features, its power would be greatly reduced. As they chatted and laughed, the flying ship flew above the raging river. However, as soon as they entered, the seemingly calm river suddenly became much more turbulent at this moment. It was as if there was a ferocious beast stirring up the water below. At the same time, Mo Wu suddenly appeared. There was a trace of hatred in his eyes. If it were not for the three of them, How could the Mo family have suffered such heavy losses? How dare you enter the raging river? Mo Wu scolded. Now, Mo Wu felt that it was a little hard to believe. The other party had been advancing step by step and had even taken Flying Cloud Mountain into their pocket. But now they had entered the raging river just like that? Of course, there was another possibility. They did not know the mysteries of the raging river, so they did not take it seriously. Why not? No matter how miraculous the raging river is, I'm afraid with your ability, it's nothing to worry about. Xiao Yang said with a sinister smile. These words still hurt their hearts. Pretending to be disdainful was enough to make them angry. Once a cultivator was affected by their own emotions, there would be some problems with their brain. In fact, there were even some details that he was unable to detect. You are indeed powerful, but once you reach the raging river, this trip will be over, Mo Wu said coldly. Although Mo Wu was very angry in his heart, he still maintained his calm. The flying ship did not stop. It continued to move forward. Mo Wu seemed to be just talking big and did not do anything. The raging river was hundreds of feet wide. When the flying ship was about to reach the center, Missouri Wu suddenly shouted, "Formation!" Immediately, the many mighty figures hiding in the raging river appeared one after another. They hovered above the water and kept making hand seals. The aura emitted by the raging river was strange to begin with. Guided by the cultivator's aura, it suddenly became even more sinister and terrifying. Gusts of cold wind blew, but Xiao Yang and the other two were indifferent. It was as if everything was within their expectations. They allowed these people to do whatever they wanted without interfering at all. Of course, interference was useless. Everyone had already set up a formation here. What they were doing now was just to consolidate it. Chapter 2743. For a time, it could be said that the wind and clouds were surging. Under the guidance of those powerful people, the raging river under their feet was like an angry beast that had been dormant for a long time, constantly roaring and roaring. It was as if the raging river, which had been silent for thousands of years, now wanted to completely erupt its anger. As the river surged, it emitted traces of coldness that penetrated into the bones, making people subconsciously shiver. In the blink of an eye, the situation could be said to have gone from bad to worse. Mo Wu, who was originally panicking, was now in high spirits. It was as if standing on the raging river. He, Mo Wu, was invincible. Mo Wu had seen the power of the 7 turns of the raging river when he was young, and it was everywhere in many ancient books, indicating that the rise of the Mo family back then began by controlling the raging river. They had relied on the power of the raging river to survive several great calamities. The Mo family was able to prosper in the in-flame world for tens of thousands of years without decline, no matter how powerful the external enemies were. They all died in the raging river with hatred. They could not be shaken at all. The raging river was inexhaustible, and the Mo family was invincible. Mo Wu was also very clear that this time he could control the 7 turns of the raging river, which was the recognition of the family head. How could he fail to live up to such painstaking efforts? This would be a battle where he shone brilliantly. In the future, he would rely on this battle to soar to the sky. It was as if the supreme power was already within his reach. This formation is really powerful. Bai Jian glanced at his feet, and the smile on the corner of his mouth faded a lot. From the trace of coldness, Bai Jian still found it difficult to guard against even with the protection of the sword qi. Be careful! The raging river has existed since the in-flame world appeared, and from some fragmentary memories, I only know that there are many strange things here. Xiao Yang said in a deep voice, with the memories of Mo and the others. How could Xiao Yang not know the power of the raging river? But he was very clear that only by completely crossing the raging river, they could completely break the backbone of the Mo family forces. The raging river was the most proud line of defense of the Mo family forces and also their foundation. If they could cross the raging river, then the Mo family would be terror-stricken and lose the ability to compete with the Four Realms Alliance. It was easy to kill some experts, but with their abilities, it was impossible to kill all of them. At that time, these people would submit on the surface, but secretly retaliate. At that time, the Four Realm Alliance would never have a day of peace. Therefore, only by beating them until their guts were torn apart and they completely lost their spirit would they be able to have peace. Peace had always been fought with fists. Princess Mingju's gaze also became much gloomier because what she sensed had already been turned upside down. That cold aura continued to rise, but it also made people feel a bit hot. It was very uncomfortable. Yo, isn't that the coward who ran away after being scared by us? Now that you have something to rely on, why are you spouting nonsense? Although Bai Jian had already sensed the danger, he still had a cheeky smile on his face. Although the raging river was indeed somewhat terrifying, Bai Jian believed that Xiaoyang would not do anything risky. No matter how strange the raging river was, it was under the premise that they could break through it. Otherwise, how could Xiaoyang not be able to break through the raging river? Even though breaking their spine was important, they had to fight with uncertainty. If Xiaoyang came alone, it would be possible. However, they were close. Xiaoyang was not someone who would put his friends in danger. This would be difficult, but it was not impossible. Mo Wu heard Bai Jian's words and immediately clenched his teeth. He was obviously furious. However, when Mo Wu decisively retreated, he was not someone who was easily angered. Only a person like Meng who would fly into a rage out of humiliation and lose his sense of propriety after just a few words. Mo Wu, on the other hand, was thinking that after this battle, although they had lost many experts, and it was not an exaggeration to say that they had suffered a great loss. However, this battle could also increase the influence of the Mo family. The problem that the entire Yin Flame world could not solve was solved by them. Why? Do you think you are invincible after using the formation and external forces? How laughable. Bai Jian continued to mock. At the same time, Bai Jian also began to accumulate sword momentum. Xiaoyang, on the other hand, was carefully observing the positions of the experts. He wanted to find the weakness of the spirit array from their positions and the circulation of their spirit qi. However, because of the intertwining of power, it was like a mess and it was difficult to find the thread. At their level, the arrangement of the formation was naturally not simple. If a formation could be found so easily, then there would be no meaning for it to exist. What was the point of putting so much effort into it? You better be so stubborn later. Mo Wu said angrily. These words in Mo Wu's ears were completely humiliating. He was beaten until his head was bleeding. He also had a lot of displeasure and pain in his heart, but Mo Wu was very clear that everything would be returned. The other experts' hand seals also gradually stopped, and they stood there like pillars. In an instant, the river below suddenly stagnated, and there was no flow of qi. However, in the next moment, like the roar of a ferocious beast, the river water rushed up to the sky. Water flowed upwards. This scene made Bai Jian click his tongue in amazement. He had never seen such a scene before, and it was indeed very shocking. In a short time, the area was completely surrounded by the river water like a hunting ground, and Xiaoyang and the other two were the prey. The river water quickly enveloped this part of the world, forming a small world that was completely isolated. The water of the raging river also changed at this moment. Like a strong oil, it whistled and burned with layers of flames. Those flames were light blue and looked extremely strange. As far as the eye could see, it was intermittent and blurry. The raging river below also became a sea of fire. Mo Jiu, who was standing on the other side of the raging river, smiled with satisfaction, as if he was very satisfied to see the formation complete. Although you are powerful, you are too stubborn. You want to make the entire Yin Flame world tremble in fear. Ha! With such mentality, don't blame me for inviting you into my trap. Mo Jiu said with a smile and muttered, The 7 turns of the raging river formation was powerful, but it took too long to set up, and it also took time to activate, so it was difficult to trap people. However, the other party just watched the formation complete without interfering. This was the path to death. Sometimes, if you ask for too much, you might have to pay with your life. Chapter 2744. The howling of the chilly wind was like the wailing of ghosts, penetrating deep into one's bones and resounding in one's heart. Just listening to it made one's scalp tingle and shudder. Fortunately, Xiaoyang and the others had strong mental fortitude. If it were any other ordinary person, their mental fortitude would have been shaken to the point of collapse after being trapped in this formation. "I hope you can still speak so boldly now," Mo said with a cold smile. At this moment, the 7 turns of the furious river formation had been completed, so Mo had nothing to fear. Previously, he was still worried that the sharp person who was good at setting up would use an unexpected method to interrupt the formation's success. However, he did not expect the other party to be so careless and not care about the formation of the formation at all. Instead, he stood aside and watched. Isn't there something strange about the Flying Cloud Mountain? And the result? Quan Hung is gone. The Flying Cloud Mountain is gone, and it has been refined into a weapon. Bai Jian was still sharp-tongued and was not at a disadvantage in terms of eloquence. The sword qi around Bai Jian was increasing, but no matter how dense the sword qi was, it was difficult to completely isolate the chilly aura outside. This furious river is quite interesting. You have to take it back and study it later, Bai Jian said with a smile. Xiaoyang also smiled and said, "This place is indeed interesting. When we return from the north, we will refine it." He said this in a relaxed and comfortable manner, as if it was true. Of course, to Xiaoyang, this furious river was indeed somewhat interesting. With his ability, it was indeed difficult to keep the furious river in the mountain river map. However, to Xiaohua, this place was extraordinary. It was a great tonic. If he could refine it, Xiaohua's strength would probably increase a lot. This was indeed a good place. If Xiaoyang was more ruthless and let Xiaohua slowly devour the Yin Flame world completely, his strength would soar to a terrifying level. "Then let me see if you have such strength," Mo said angrily. At the same time, Mo was not in a hurry to make a move. Instead, he felt the exquisiteness of the formation. Mo only understood the 7 turns of the furious river formation a few days ago. As for how to control it, it was passed down to him by the family head. For Mo, the longer he delayed, the more advantageous it would be for him. If he could completely control the furious river, and even understand every detail of it like the back of his hand, then even if a Tier 7 powerhouse came, he had the confidence to make them return in defeat. "Put away the airship, lest we have to fly to the north," Xiaoyang whispered. Princess Mingzhu shook her head with a smile and said, "This thing isn't worth much. Back then, I refined quite a few. If I run out, I can just take out another one." As soon as he finished speaking, the airship quickly sank and charged towards Mo. Back then, Princess Mingzhu had used her own airships as invitations, and there were 100 of them. When she had nothing to do, she would also refine quite a few airships. If it weren't for the limited resources, Princess Mingzhu could have given everyone in the god realm a flying ship. Mo snorted coldly when he saw the flying ship approaching. With a wave of his hand, a huge palm appeared from the river and grabbed the ship. In a moment, the airship's advance became very slow, and it looked like it was about to fall. Light blue flames burned on it. Although the burning speed wasn't very fast, it wouldn't take long for it to be completely destroyed. Mo pressed down with his hand, and the airship was instantly pressed into the river. It didn't cause any waves, and it was silent. "This is a saint-level artifact, and it's gone?" Bai Jian's mouth twitched as he muttered. He wasn't sighing at the terrifying power of the formation, but that the artifact was gone. It was a complete waste. Although the Sword Heart realm had undergone many changes after coming to the Middle World, saint-level artifacts were still the standard. He didn't expect it to be gone just like that. How could he not feel heartache? Princess Mingzhu frowned. Although the airship was something she casually refined and wasn't used for battle, it was still a saint-level artifact. In the end, it was gone just like that. It was enough to see how terrifying the formation's power was. Moreover, from the casual wave of his hand, it was clear that Mo Wu had a formation on him. His combat power had multiplied. Mo Wu smiled with satisfaction. He was very satisfied with the ability he could use now. Previously, he did feel that he wasn't on the same level as Xiao Yang and the other two. However, now that he had this kind of power, he felt that he could still compete with them. In the next moment, Princess Mingzhu unsheathed her sword. Instantly, the sword light was dazzling and bright. The sword qi that had been accumulating for a long time suddenly appeared at this moment. It fell from the sky and slashed at Mo Wu. Since the airship couldn't be seen in front of her, she would use a sword to test it. Princess Mingzhu didn't like too many twists and turns, so she felt that it was better to attack directly. As for observing the operation of the formation and how to break it, she would leave it to Xiao Yang. Since he wasn't good at this, he would do something he was good at. Although they hadn't fought side by side for a long time, they had already reached a tacit understanding. Of course, the most important thing was that they could unconditionally trust the person beside them. This was the reason why they dared to rush into danger. Looking at the golden sword light falling from the sky, Missouri Wu didn't frown. He just felt that it was interesting. If it had been before, Mo Wu wouldn't have dared to take this sword light head-on. He could only dodge. However, this was the raging river, and he was the one who controlled it. With a low shout, countless sparks fell and attached themselves to the sword light. They slowly nibbled away at the sword light. Seeing that the sword light was beginning to dim and its power was being absorbed, Bai Jian couldn't help but be shocked. This was indeed terrifying. Soon after, Mo Wu extended his hand and grabbed the sword light in his hand. With a little force, he crushed it into pieces. The so-called genius is nothing more than this. Mo Wu laughed. He was laughing very happily. He never thought that he would be able to do it so easily. The power of the raging river was indeed extraordinary. The lethality of the sword light was indeed extraordinary. However, it didn't seem to be of much use here. As for Mo Wu, since he was standing here, he was the god here. When the rest of the people controlling the array saw this scene, they couldn't help but gasp. They had seen the battlefield on Soaring Cloud Mountain. They knew how domineering and unreasonable that woman's sword qi was. Now, her sword qi looked mediocre. Whether it was domineering or sharp, it was mediocre compared to this. Chapter 2745. That flame is able to devour power. That's really unexpected. Princess Mingzhu said solemnly. There was a hint of nervousness in her tone. If the other party could use such a method to devour their attacks, then perhaps other attacks could be neutralized in the same way. In that case, no matter what kind of attacks they used, they would be neutralized by Mo Wu. In that case, was there a need to continue fighting? Even if they were exhausted to death, they might not be able to hurt the other party. Of course, they could still crush it with absolute power. However, with the ability of the three of them, wanting to go against this world and this raging river that had existed for a long time was undoubtedly a fantasy. Even if an emperor god came, he might not be able to break this formation. It seems like we're in danger. Bai Jian smiled bitterly. Although Bai Jian's attitude was very good, after seeing the other party's strange method, he felt that this matter was difficult. They were good at crushing the other party with details and strength. However, these advantages were now limited by this formation. I'm afraid I'll need some time to find out the origin of this formation. Xiao Yang frowned. It was impossible to break the formation by force. If they attacked without knowing anything, they would be like a headless fly. It would be useless and a waste of energy. It was not that Xiao Yang was careless and caused the three of them to be in danger, but how many miraculous uses did this 7 turns of the Furious River Array have? Even core members like Mo and were not very clear about it, so how could he be blamed for this? However, Xiao Yang's experience was still quite rich. No matter how many changes there were, it was still the same. If he could find some clues, then he would be able to make a comeback. Can we break it? Princess Mingzhu asked. Xiao Yang frowned. If we use too little strength, I'm afraid we won't be able to find any clues. Okay. Princess Mingzhu was resolute and decisive. She had always been a valiant woman. Princess Mingzhu did not care about how many tricks she had. As long as she knew she was confident, she would do her best. As for a way out, she was not in the mood to think about it. Moreover, if they wanted peace in the Four-Realm Alliance, there was no way out. The way out they discussed in the God Realm was just to make everyone feel at ease and to let them take the risk. Bai Jian also pulled out his sword and looked at Mo Wu coldly. The current situation could be said to be very bad, so there was no chance for him to smile mischievously. Weren't you very arrogant earlier? Why do you look so lifeless now? Mo Wu laughed out loud as he spoke. Now, Mo Wu felt very carefree. Looking at the helpless appearance of the enemy, he felt very comfortable. Because of this formation, their situations were even more reversed. Even the spectators outside started laughing. Looks like I was worrying too much. The 7 cycles of Furious River formation is already invincible. To think that I was actually thinking of holding back. The smile on Mo Jio's face became much wider. Although this was only the beginning, he could already see the results. What happened next was just the 3 of them fighting like trapped beasts. Once Mo Wu became more familiar with the Raging River formation, it would be the time for them to die. It seems that I am really old. That is why my courage has become so small. Mo Jio muttered in a somewhat self-deprecating manner. At this moment, Mo Wu could be said to be complacent. He never thought that he would have the opportunity to personally control and preside over the Raging River formation that existed in the ancient books. Even if he would inevitably suffer some backlash in the future, it would not matter. Xiao Yang looked at the raging river water that had turned into flames and suddenly thought of the black fire in the mountain wheel realm. The black fire also had the ability to swallow everything and could strengthen itself. However, this raging river seemed to lack some meaning. Perhaps the things that it could swallow were also very limited. Thinking of this, Xiao Yang had a rough idea of what was going on, but his eyes continued to wander. He saw that other than Mo Wu, there were 3 other people in the open. Those who could be in the open were definitely not the Formation Eye. They might even be the Death Door. If they rushed over forcefully, it would be like walking into a trap. Therefore, those who were hiding in the dark were probably the key to breaking the formation. However, they were hiding in the Raging River, and the Raging River had turned into a sea of fire. No matter how strong Xiao Yang's divine soul was, under the gloomy and cold aura, it was difficult to extend his perception and find those guys one by one. Suddenly, a chilly wind blew. Countless flames gathered and dispersed, becoming impermanent like flying sand. It was impossible to see through and understand. Just as he was lost in thought, Xiao Yang suddenly woke up. Be careful of these flames. Once you come into contact with them, it will be very troublesome. They will silently erode and devour our spirit energy, Xiao Yang angrily shouted. If he had not noticed that the will protecting his body was being eaten away, Xiao Yang would not have sensed it. This was the most terrifying thing. Princess Mingzhu and Bai Jian were shocked. After careful inspection, they found that their clothes were already damaged and there were no signs of life. They did not have any perception, and the danger was already lurking around. Although these small flames could not pose a threat to them, once there were enough of them and they gradually grew stronger, it would be particularly terrifying. Hearing Xiao Yang's words, Mo Wu's face could not help but change. He had been very careful in controlling it, but he did not expect to be discovered. Next, you will be bound and will even spend more energy on defense. How can you fight me like this? Mo Wu sneered. Mo Wu was telling the truth. He said it clearly, but there was no other way. It was an open conspiracy. Bai Jian was angry and speechless. He held the hilt of his sword tightly, and endless anger poured into the sword. Princess Mingzhu slowly took out a robe and put on. She did not use her spiritual power to resist and let the sand-like flames fall on her robe, but it was useless. "I only have one of this robe," Princess Mingzhu said helplessly. Xiaoyang just smiled. Such a precious spiritual weapon was rare even in the realm of the gods. However, with such a robe, Princess Mingzhu would be less restricted. Comparisons are odious. Your god realm is indeed rich and overbearing. Under such circumstances, you are still able to take out a comparable artifact. Bai Jian complained rather helplessly. Princess Mingzhu just smiled indifferently and said, "These flames mainly devour spiritual power, but my robe isolates spiritual power, so I am immune." Bai Jian just shook his head helplessly. They were cultivators. How could they seal their spiritual power? Chapter 2746. Now Bai Jian was having a headache. These strange flames could devour spiritual energy and use their own spiritual energy as fuel to burn. This was something that could be said to be helpless against. The only thing they could do now was to use their incomparably tyrannical strength to shake off these strange flames that were like maggots in the bones. This was the only way to ensure that they would not be slowly eaten away. The more he thought about it, the more anxious and helpless Bai Jian became. He had always liked to attack without any scruples and show his most powerful side without holding back. However, these strange flames prevented him from doing so it was inevitable that he would not be able to show his full strength. If he could not use his full strength, the sharpness of his swordsmanship would be greatly reduced. Bai Jian felt extremely aggrieved when he saw that his opponent was asking for a beating. Yet he could not rush over and kill him to his heart's content. He had no choice but to use his own strength to resist such an attack, and it was difficult to continue. Princess Mingzhu was not afraid of these flames because she was wearing a robe. Her eyes were constantly wandering around, as if she was trying to find an opportunity to break the formation. However, how could it be so easy? The 7 rotations of the Furious River Formation had protected the Mo family for tens of thousands of years. Naturally, it would not be that simple. It was impossible to see through the clues in such a short period of time. Mo Wu looked at everyone's helpless appearance and felt very happy in his heart. They had been so arrogant before, but now what was the use? In front of the Mo family's final trump card, they were still helpless. Even if they racked their brains, they might not be able to find a way to break the formation. Since ancient times, when the Mo family had been entrenched in the Furious River, this had been their invincible place. The martial emperors who were standing still also revealed traces of smiles. Everyone had witnessed the valiance of these 3 people. However, even if they were dragons now, they still had to obediently sit down. If they wanted to live, they would have to look at these 3 people's faces. No matter how strong a person's ability was, it was very limited. In front of the great Tao of the world, it was just a drop in the ocean. Under the general trend, it was difficult to reverse it no matter how strong one was. Xiaoyang furrowed his brows as he felt the cold aura around him and the strange, burning sensation. For a moment, he couldn't think of a reliable way to break it, so he couldn't help but feel a little anxious. However, it was impossible for him to fall just like that. All of a sudden, with a thought, the divine sword in his hand suddenly burst into flames. Countless flaming sword qi circled around him like a city wall, twisting and killing. Both of them were flames, but their attributes were vastly different. However, such an idea and approach allowed Xiaoyang to heave a sigh of relief. Under such scorching flames, the cold aura was more or less dispelled. Although it was inevitable that some fish would slip through the net, it was difficult to shake him. Xiaoyang heaved a sigh of relief when he was able to separate the flames. He was no longer restricted from doing things in peace. Seeing Xiaoyang suddenly shake off the cold flames, Mo Wu's face darkened. However, he wasn't too surprised. It was normal for the other party to have some way to deal with it. If they behaved like soft persimmons in this great formation, it would be disappointing. Of course, if that was the case, they wouldn't even be able to pass Soaring Cloud Mountain, let alone reach the Furious River and shake the entire Mo family. So, what can you do? Mo Wu's voice became much gloomier as he spoke. Mo Wu knew very well that the young man in front of him was definitely not someone to be trifled with. Moreover, he was very meticulous. Since the other party was prepared to take the risk, he must be very confident. The more time passed, the more advantageous it would be for Mo Wu. However, he was also very clear that if the other party really found some clues, the situation would probably become worse because of this. It might even be out of control. There's nothing I can do. Xiaoyang smiled faintly as if he had a card up his sleeve. On the other side, Bai Jian was in great pain. He saw that the two of them had ways to guard against the flames so that they couldn't hurt him. On the contrary, he was still helpless. It was infuriating to compare oneself to others. One of them relied on his family's wealth and could take out a high-grade magic tool to protect himself. The other was knowledgeable and knew a lot of things. Therefore, he could find a way to contend against the other party. On the other hand, Bai Jian only knew how to practice the sword. In the next moment, Xiaoyang slashed out with the divine sword in his hand. Suddenly, a flaming sword qi rushed towards Mo Wu like a dragon. Now, Xiaoyang could only rely on the power of the divine sword. If he only relied on the strength of the flames to fight, it might be a way out. Seeing the flaming sword qi that was like a dragon rushing towards him, Mo Wu only snorted coldly. He didn't care too much and also slapped out with his palm. After the palm was slapped out, the palm wind was like a cold wind, wailing like ghosts and howling like wolves. As the leader of this formation, Mo Wu's every move could affect the power in the surrounding area and make it submit to him. The flaming dragon collided with the palm print and shook it. However, the scattered Yin flames wrapped around the flaming dragon and nibbled at it at an extremely fast speed. It was like snowflakes falling, but it made people feel that it was gloomy. Seeing that the falling flames were gradually assimilated and turned into Yin flames, Xiaoyang shook his head helplessly. It seemed that it was a fool's dream to simply rely on the power of the Thunder Fire Divine sword to defeat him. How could he suppress his opponent with the power of one man and one sword? He had the absolute advantage of time, location, and people. It's just SOO, Mo Wu said disdainfully. Hearing these words, Xiaoyang didn't take it to heart. What he did before was just to try his luck and see if he could succeed. Even if it didn't work, there was no other way. He just had to find another way out. However, it was not easy to find a way out. Therefore, this battle would probably continue to be in a stalemate. Show me what you're capable of. Otherwise, you won't have the chance later, Mo Wu said with a cold smile. Xiaoyang smiled faintly. He knew that Mo Wu was probably not very familiar with the control of this array. That was why he said that. He used words to provoke them and make them lose their sense of propriety. Suddenly, Bai Jian's sword was unsheathed. After a long period of silence, he once again slashed out with his sword, at a moment that no one had expected.